You have been taught that peace comes from control. They told you that if you planned enough, thought enough, prepared enough, and stayed ahead of every problem, then life would finally feel safe. But if that were true, why does the mind become more tired the more it tries to manage everything? Why do so many people who work so hard to keep life together still feel anxious, restless, and unable to breathe deeply? The truth is, inner peace does not come when life obeys you. It comes when you stop demanding that it does. Buddhist wisdom has revealed this for centuries. The deepest suffering is not in change, not in uncertainty, and not in the unknown, but in the mind's endless struggle to control what was never meant to be controlled. Tonight, as you listen to these lessons, something will begin to soften. The tension in your chest will start to loosen. The noise in your mind will begin to fade, and the heavy need to force every outcome will slowly give way to calm, clarity, and freedom. This is not just another talk to fall asleep to. This is the moment you begin to stop fighting life and finally rest inside it. Are you ready? Let's begin. Something inside you already knows this. You have felt it in quiet moments, when everything looked fine on the outside, yet something inside refused to settle. That subtle tension, that constant alertness, that feeling that something still needs to be fixed before you can finally relax. It does not come from life itself. It comes from the way the mind holds on to life. And this is where the real understanding begins, not on the surface, but underneath the effort you call responsibility. A quiet question starts to rise. What if the pressure you feel is not from what you are carrying, but from how tightly you are holding it? Let's go deeper. There is a kind of pain that hides behind competence. It does not cry for attention. It does not look broken. In fact, it often looks like strength. It shows up as being reliable, always prepared, always thinking ahead, always trying to make sure nothing goes wrong. From the outside, it looks like control. From the inside, it feels like never being able to switch off. This suffering is subtle. It does not arrive as a dramatic collapse. It builds slowly, layer by layer, thought by thought, until it becomes your normal state. You wake up already thinking about what needs to be handled. Conversations become things to manage. Situations become things to fix. Even moments of rest are interrupted by quiet calculations about what might go wrong next. It feels like you are doing the right thing. You are being responsible. You are staying on top of things. But what is rarely seen is the cost of this way of living. The mind that constantly tries to control is never at rest. Even when nothing is happening, it is preparing. Even when everything is fine, it is scanning for problems. Even when you sit in silence, there is an underlying movement, a background noise that says, "Stay alert, something might happen." This is the suffering hidden inside control. It is not loud, it is constant. The need to manage people is one of the heaviest parts of this burden. There is a subtle belief that if you say the right things, behave the right way, and respond correctly, you can shape how others think of you, how they treat you, and how they behave. So the mind begins to monitor every interaction. It analyzes tone, words, reactions. It replays conversations, wondering what could have been said better. And even when the interaction ends, the mind does not let go. It continues to adjust, to predict, to plan for the next time. This creates a silent pressure. You are not just living your life, you are managing impressions, managing expectations, managing reactions. And because other people are unpredictable, this task never ends. You cannot fully control another human being. Yet the mind keeps trying. And in that effort, peace is lost. There is also the need to control results. This is where the mind becomes deeply attached. You start something, and immediately there is an image of how it should turn out. A conversation should go smoothly, a plan should succeed, effort should lead to a specific reward. At first, this seems harmless, but slowly the mind stops focusing on the action itself and becomes obsessed with the outcome. Now every step carries pressure. If the result is uncertain, anxiety appears. If things do not go as expected, frustration grows. If there is delay, the mind becomes restless. It starts pushing harder, thinking more, trying to force things into place, and even when the result is achieved, the peace does not last. Because the mind has already moved to the next outcome, the next thing that needs to be controlled. So the cycle continues. There is no true rest in a mind that is always tied to results. Time becomes another thing the mind tries to control. It wants things to happen at the right moment, not too early, not too late. It resists delays. It fears wasted time. It rushes the future and rejects the present. You start to feel that life should be moving faster or differently or more smoothly, and when it does not, tension builds, waiting becomes uncomfortable, uncertainty becomes unbearable. The present moment feels like an obstacle instead of a place to live. This creates a constant feeling of being out of sync with life. Instead of flowing with time, the mind fights it. And this fight creates exhaustion. Uncertainty is perhaps the most difficult part. The mind does not like not knowing. It wants clarity, guarantees, answers. It wants to feel safe by understanding what will happen next. But life does not work that way. No matter how much you plan, there are always variables beyond your reach. Other people make their own choices. Circumstances shift. Things change without warning. And yet, the mind continues to demand certainty. This demand creates fear. Not because uncertainty is dangerous, but because the mind treats it as if it is. So it tries to reduce that uncertainty by thinking more, planning more, preparing more. But the more it tries, the more it realizes it cannot fully succeed. And this creates a deeper level of anxiety. It feels like standing on unstable ground, constantly trying to make it solid. But the ground was never meant to be fixed. The deeper truth is this: control is not the same as stability. It only feels that way. Control gives the illusion that if you try hard enough, think carefully enough, and manage everything correctly, you can create a predictable life. But life is not predictable. And every time reality does something unexpected, the illusion cracks. That crack is felt as stress. The more the mind tries to hold everything together, the more fragile everything feels, because the system depends on constant effort. The moment that effort weakens, everything seems like it might fall apart. So the mind becomes even more vigilant. It tightens its grip. It tries harder. But this only increases the pressure. There is also a hidden identity inside control. It becomes part of who you believe you are. You start to see yourself as the one who keeps things together, the one who solves problems, the one who handles everything. And while this can feel empowering, it also becomes a trap. Because now, letting go feels like losing yourself. If you are not controlling, who are you? If you are not managing, what are you doing? So even when the mind is tired, it continues. Not because it wants to, but because it does not know how to stop. This is why control becomes addictive. It creates a temporary sense of safety. It gives the feeling that something is being done, that things are under control. But underneath, the tension remains, and over time, it grows. The body starts to feel it: tight shoulders, shallow breathing, restlessness, even in stillness, difficulty relaxing, difficulty being present. The mind starts to feel it too. Overthinking, doubt, irritation, a constant sense that something is not quite right. And yet, it is hard to trace it back to control, because control has been disguised as responsibility for so long. But responsibility does not require tension. Responsibility does not require fear. Responsibility does not require the constant need to predict and manage everything. True responsibility is simply doing what can be done in the moment, with clarity, without clinging to what happens next. Control goes beyond that. It tries to take ownership of things that were never yours to own. It tries to shape outcomes that depend on countless causes beyond your reach. It tries to freeze a reality that is always moving, and in doing so, it creates resistance. That resistance is what hurts. Not the situation, not the uncertainty, but the constant pushing against what is. This is why even small things can feel overwhelming. It is not the size of the problem. It is the accumulated pressure of trying to control everything at once. When the mind finally pauses, even for a moment, there is a glimpse of something different, a space without tension, a moment where nothing needs to be fixed, a brief sense that everything is already okay, even if nothing has been resolved. That moment is important because it shows something that is often missed. Peace is not created by control. It is revealed when control stops. This does not mean you stop acting. It does not mean you stop caring. It does not mean you abandon your life. It means you stop trying to control what cannot be controlled. You stop carrying what was never yours to carry. You stop fighting a reality that is already unfolding on its own. And in that shift, something begins to loosen. The grip softens. The mind becomes quieter. The body begins to relax. Not because everything is perfect, but because the need for everything to be perfect has started to dissolve. And in that space, something deeper begins to emerge. Not effort, not tension, but a quiet sense of ease. And that ease is not something you create. It is something that was always there, hidden underneath the struggle to control. Now that this hidden suffering has been seen more clearly, something else begins to come into focus. Because the need to control is not random. It comes from a deeper place. A place that believes it needs control to feel safe. And understanding that place changes everything. As the grip begins to loosen, something uncomfortable starts to surface. Not relief, not immediately, something deeper, a quiet unease that was always there, just hidden beneath all the effort. Because when control starts to fade, the mind no longer feels as certain as it used to, and that is when the real attachment reveals itself. It was never just about control. It was about needing life to behave in a certain way in order to feel safe. And this is where the next layer unfolds. There is a subtle dependence most people never question. It does not look like fear at first. It looks like preference, like structure, like wanting things to make sense. But underneath it, there is something much stronger. A need for life to be predictable. There is a quiet comfort when things go as expected, when people respond the way they should, when plans unfold without disruption, when the future seems clear, even if only for a moment. In those moments, the mind relaxes, not because everything is perfect, but because it feels like it understands what is happening. And that understanding gives a temporary sense of control. But this comfort comes at a cost. Because the moment something shifts, even slightly, the mind reacts. A message is not answered the way it was expected. A plan changes. Someone behaves differently. A situation turns uncertain. And immediately, something inside tightens. That tightening is not random. It is the ego reacting to unpredictability. The ego does not like uncertainty. It does not like not knowing. It feels safe only when it can map out reality, label it, and predict what comes next. It wants a stable story, a clear pattern, a sense that life is following a script it understands. When that script breaks, even in small ways, it feels like a threat. Not because something dangerous is happening, but because the ego is losing its sense of orientation. The ego is built on identity, and identity depends on consistency. It wants to know who it is in every situation. It wants to know how others see it. It wants to know what role it is playing. Predictability supports that. When life behaves as expected, the ego feels confirmed. It feels like it is in the right place, doing the right thing, being the right version of itself. But when life becomes unpredictable, that certainty disappears, and with it, a sense of stability is lost. This is why small disruptions can feel bigger than they are. It is not the event itself that creates the discomfort. It is what the event represents. It represents the unknown. It represents the loss of control. It represents the collapse of the story the ego was holding on to. And that collapse feels unsettling. The ego quickly tries to restore order. It begins analyzing, questioning, searching for explanations. It tries to rebuild a sense of predictability by thinking more, planning more, interpreting more. But this effort does not bring peace. It creates more movement, more noise, more tension, because life continues to move in ways that cannot be fully predicted, and the ego keeps chasing something it cannot catch. There is also a deeper layer to this attachment. Predictability gives the illusion of permanence. When things stay the same, even for a short time, it feels like they will continue that way. It creates a false sense that stability can be maintained, that change can be minimized, that uncertainty can be reduced. But life is constantly shifting. Everything changes, whether slowly or suddenly. People evolve, circumstances shift, emotions rise and fall. Situations transform in ways no one can fully control, and the ego resists this. It tries to hold on to familiar patterns. It prefers repetition over change. It clings to what it knows, even if what it knows is not fulfilling, because familiarity feels safer than the unknown. This is why people often stay in situations that no longer serve them, not because they are unaware, but because leaving would mean stepping into unpredictability. And unpredictability feels threatening to the ego, so it chooses what is known over what is true. It chooses comfort over growth. It chooses stability over peace. But that stability is fragile because it depends on life staying the same. And life does not stay the same. So the ego remains in a constant state of adjustment. It tries to maintain predictability in an unpredictable world. It tries to create fixed outcomes in a reality that is always moving, and this creates ongoing tension. Even when things seem stable, there is a background awareness that they might change. That awareness creates subtle anxiety, a quiet anticipation that something could go wrong. So even in moments of calm, the mind is not fully at ease. It is waiting, watching, preparing. This is the hidden cost of needing predictability. Peace becomes conditional. It depends on things going a certain way. It depends on life behaving within certain boundaries. And because those boundaries cannot be guaranteed, peace remains unstable. The ego then becomes more rigid. It starts to define what is acceptable and what is not. It creates expectations for how life should unfold. It sets conditions for when it can relax, when it can feel safe, when it can let go. And those conditions are rarely met completely. So the mind stays active, always adjusting, always comparing, always measuring reality against expectation. This creates a subtle but constant dissatisfaction. Because reality is never exactly as the ego wants it to be. There is always something slightly off, something that does not match, something that needs to be corrected. And so the cycle continues. The ego's addiction to predictability keeps the mind locked in a loop of expectation and reaction, a loop of control and disappointment, a loop of seeking stability in a world that does not offer it. This is why true peace feels distant, not because it is far away, but because the conditions placed on it are too strict. The ego says, "I will be at peace when things are certain." But certainty never fully arrives, so peace keeps getting postponed. What Buddhist wisdom reveals is something very different. Peace is not found in predictability, it is found in the absence of the need for it. It is not about making life stable, it is about becoming stable within life's instability. This is a completely different direction. Instead of trying to shape reality into something predictable, the focus shifts to understanding the nature of reality itself. Reality is uncertain. Reality is changing. Reality is not fixed. And when this is seen clearly, something begins to soften. The resistance starts to fade, not because uncertainty disappears, but because it is no longer being treated as a problem. The ego's grip loosens. The need to know everything in advance begins to dissolve, and in that space, a different kind of stability appears. Not the stability of fixed outcomes, but the stability of not needing them. This stability does not depend on circumstances. It does not depend on how things unfold. It comes from letting go of the demand for predictability, from allowing life to move without trying to control every step, from accepting that not everything needs to be known in order to be okay. This acceptance is not passive. It is not giving up. It is a deep understanding that life cannot be fully predicted, and that trying to do so only creates suffering. When this understanding becomes clear, the mind becomes lighter. It stops chasing certainty. It stops forcing explanations. It becomes more open, more flexible, more at ease with not knowing. And in that openness, peace begins to emerge, not as something created, but as something uncovered, something that was always there, beneath the need for everything to make sense. Now, as this attachment to predictability becomes more visible, another layer begins to reveal itself. Because if the ego fears unpredictability this deeply, there must be something it believes is at risk. And understanding that fear takes this journey even deeper. As the need for predictability begins to loosen, something deeper starts to show itself. It is no longer just about wanting life to go a certain way. There is a deeper reaction, something more instinctive, almost automatic. The moment things become unclear, the moment the future is not visible, something inside tightens again. Not because something has gone wrong, but because something feels threatened. And this is where the real question begins to unfold. What exactly feels at risk when nothing harmful is actually happening? Let's go deeper. There is a quiet discomfort that appears the moment certainty disappears. It does not need a real danger. It does not require a clear problem. All it needs is the absence of knowing, and suddenly the mind begins to react as if something is wrong. The body may still be safe. The environment may still be calm. Nothing dangerous may be taking place. Yet inside there is movement, a subtle unease, a tightening in the chest, a restless urge to figure things out. This reaction is not random. It is the mind interpreting uncertainty as a threat. But the question is, why? Why does not knowing feel so uncomfortable, even when there is no actual danger? Buddhist wisdom points to something very precise. The mind does not fear uncertainty because of what is happening outside. It fears it because of what it cannot maintain inside. The sense of a stable self. The ego depends on continuity. It builds a story about who you are, where you are going, and how life should unfold. This story creates a sense of identity. It gives structure. It gives direction. It gives the feeling that things are under control. But this story relies on knowing what comes next, knowing how things will turn out, knowing where you stand. Uncertainty disrupts that. It creates a gap in the story, and that gap feels like instability. When the mind cannot predict what will happen, it also cannot confirm the identity it is holding on to. It cannot maintain the same sense of self with the same level of certainty. So it reacts. It tries to fill the gap with thoughts. It searches for answers. It creates possibilities, often negative ones, because negative outcomes feel like something to prepare for. This is why uncertainty often leads to overthinking, Not because the mind wants to suffer, but because it is trying to restore a sense of control. It is trying to rebuild the story, but the more it thinks, the more it realizes it cannot fully know. And this creates more tension. The deeper issue is not uncertainty itself. It is the belief that uncertainty should not exist. The mind expects clarity. It expects stability. It expects to be able to map out reality in a way that feels solid. When that expectation is not met, it feels like something is wrong. But nothing is wrong. Life has always been uncertain. The future has never been guaranteed. Outcomes have never been fully predictable. The only difference is that sometimes the illusion of certainty is stronger and sometimes it is weaker. When the illusion weakens, the underlying truth becomes visible. And that truth feels uncomfortable because it challenges the idea of control. There is also a biological layer to this. The human mind is designed to detect threats. It evolved to look for danger, to anticipate problems, to prepare for the worst. This helped survival in environments where real threats were present. But in modern life, this system often misfires. It treats uncertainty as danger, even when there is no real threat. A delayed message becomes a sign of rejection. A change in plans becomes a sign of failure. A lack of clarity becomes a sign that something is wrong. The mind fills the unknown with imagined problems, and those imagined problems create real emotional reactions. Fear, anxiety, restlessness, all triggered not by reality, but by interpretation. This is why uncertainty can feel so intense. It is not just a lack of information. It is the mind projecting potential threats into that empty space. And once those projections begin, they can quickly spiral. The mind jumps from one possibility to another, trying to find certainty, trying to find a stable ground to stand on. But the ground does not appear, so the movement continues. This creates a loop. Uncertainty leads to thinking. Thinking leads to more uncertainty. More uncertainty leads to more thinking. And the cycle feeds itself. Buddhist teaching invites a different way of seeing this. It suggests that the problem is not the uncertainty, and it is not even the thoughts. The problem is the identification with the need to know, the belief that the self depends on certainty. When this belief is strong, uncertainty feels like a threat to existence itself. Not physical existence, but psychological existence. The ego feels like it is losing its footing. It feels like it cannot define itself clearly. And that lack of definition feels uncomfortable, so it resists. It tries to push uncertainty away. It tries to replace it with conclusions, even if those conclusions are not accurate. Because something certain, even if it is negative, feels more stable than something unknown. This is why the mind often prefers a negative answer over no answer at all. Because at least it feels like something is known. But this comes at a cost. It creates unnecessary suffering, because the mind is reacting to imagined scenarios instead of actual reality. The deeper insight here is that uncertainty does not threaten the self. It threatens the illusion of a fixed self. In Buddhist understanding, the self is not a solid, unchanging entity. It is a collection of thoughts, feelings, perceptions, and experiences that are constantly changing. There is no fixed center, no permanent identity that needs to be maintained, but the ego does not see this. It believes in a stable self, and it tries to protect that belief. Uncertainty challenges it, because uncertainty reveals that things are not fixed, not the future, not circumstances, not even identity. And this revelation feels destabilizing, so the mind reacts. But when this is seen clearly, something begins to shift. If the self is not fixed, then it does not need to be protected in the way the ego assumes. If identity is fluid, then uncertainty is not a threat. It is simply part of the natural movement of life. This understanding changes the relationship with uncertainty. Instead of resisting it, There is space to observe it, to notice the reaction without immediately acting on it, to feel the discomfort without trying to eliminate it. And in that observation, something interesting happens. The intensity begins to decrease because the reaction is no longer being fed. The mind is no longer trying to escape uncertainty, it is allowing it. And in that allowance, the sense of threat begins to dissolve. Not completely at first, but gradually. The body starts to relax. The thoughts slow down. The need to find immediate answers softens, and a different kind of stability begins to appear. Not the stability of knowing everything, but the stability of being okay without knowing. This is a subtle but powerful shift. It does not remove uncertainty from life. It removes the suffering created by resisting it. And that changes everything, because now uncertainty is no longer an enemy. It becomes part of the experience. Something that can be felt without panic. Something that can exist without being turned into a problem. This creates a new kind of freedom. The freedom to move through life without needing constant reassurance. The freedom to experience the present moment without projecting into the future. The freedom to allow things to unfold without forcing them into a fixed shape. And in that freedom, peace begins to deepen, not as a result of controlling life, but as a result of no longer being controlled by the need to control. Now, as this fear of uncertainty becomes clearer, another layer begins to emerge. Because even though the mind fears the unknown, it also tries to deal with it in a very specific way. It starts to plan, to prepare, to organize life in a way that feels manageable, and this leads to another subtle trap that often goes unnoticed. As the fear of uncertainty begins to reveal itself, the mind does something that feels logical, even intelligent. It tries to reduce that uncertainty. It begins to plan, to organize, to prepare for every possible outcome. At first, this seems like wisdom. It feels responsible, even necessary. But if you look closely, something else is happening beneath the surface. The planning is not just about preparation anymore. It becomes a way to feel safe. And this is where the next layer quietly takes hold. There is a strange comfort in having a plan. Even if nothing has happened yet, even if the future has not arrived, the mind feels calmer when it believes it has already mapped things out. It creates a sense of direction, a sense of order, a sense that things are under control. But that sense is fragile because the plan exists in the mind, not in reality. And reality does not follow the mind. There is a subtle shift that happens when planning moves from being useful to becoming excessive. At first, planning is a tool. It helps organize action. It helps bring clarity to what can be done. It serves a purpose. But slowly, without being noticed, it becomes something else. It becomes a shield. The mind begins to believe that if it can think far enough ahead, if it can prepare for every possibility, if it can cover every angle, then it can prevent discomfort. It can avoid failure. It can control outcomes. And this belief creates a quiet attachment. Now, planning is no longer about action. It is about protection. The mind starts to spend more time in the future than in the present. It begins to rehearse situations that have not happened. It creates scenarios, solutions, responses. It tries to solve problems that do not yet exist. This feels productive, but it is not the same as being present. It is a movement away from reality. The more the mind plans, the more it feels like it is doing something important. It feels like progress. It feels like safety is being built. But underneath, there is still tension, because no matter how much is planned, there is always something unknown. And the mind knows this, so it plans more and more and more. This is how planning becomes a trap, not because planning itself is wrong, but because of what it begins to represent. It starts to represent control over life. The mind confuses preparation with power. It begins to believe that if it can plan well enough, it can shape reality into something predictable. It can reduce uncertainty to a manageable level. It can create a future that feels secure. But this is an illusion, because life does not follow plans. Plans are based on assumptions. They depend on conditions staying the same, on people behaving in certain ways, on circumstances aligning as expected. But life is constantly changing. Conditions shift. People act in ways that cannot be predicted. Situations unfold in unexpected directions, and when reality does not match the plan, the mind reacts. It feels frustrated, it feels unsettled, it feels like something has gone wrong. But nothing has gone wrong. The plan was never guaranteed. The discomfort comes from the expectation that it should have been. This is where the illusion becomes clear. Planning gives the feeling of control, but it does not provide actual control. It gives a temporary sense of certainty, but it cannot remove uncertainty. And when the mind depends on that sense of certainty, it becomes vulnerable. Because the moment the plan breaks, the sense of safety breaks with it. This creates a cycle. The mind plans to feel safe. The plan fails to provide lasting safety. The mind feels anxious again, so it plans even more, trying to fix the discomfort it created. This cycle can become endless. It can take over the way the mind operates. Even simple situations become complicated. Every decision requires analysis. Every possibility needs to be considered. Every outcome needs to be prepared for. This creates mental fatigue, because the mind is trying to do something it cannot fully do. It is trying to control the future. There is also a deeper issue. Overplanning disconnects you from the present moment. When the mind is always ahead, always thinking about what comes next, it loses contact with what is happening now, and the present moment is the only place where life is actually experienced. So even if everything is planned perfectly, even if the future unfolds in a favorable way, there is still a sense of something missing. Because the mind was never fully here, it was always somewhere else. Planning becomes a way of avoiding the present, not intentionally, but as a side effect. The mind feels more comfortable dealing with imagined futures than with the uncertainty of the current moment. So it stays there. But this creates a subtle emptiness, because life is not happening in those imagined futures. It is happening now, and when the mind is not here, it cannot fully experience it. This is why people often reach moments they have planned for and still feel unsatisfied. The outcome is there, but the presence was not. So the experience feels incomplete. There is also the emotional cost of overplanning. When the mind becomes attached to a plan, it becomes attached to a specific outcome. It starts to expect things to happen in a certain way, and when they do not, there is disappointment. Not because the situation is necessarily bad, but because it did not match the expectation. This creates unnecessary suffering, because the pain is not coming from reality. It is coming from the difference between reality and the plan. The more detailed the plan, the greater the attachment. And the greater the attachment, the stronger the reaction when things change. This makes the mind more rigid, less flexible, less able to adapt. Instead of responding to life as it unfolds, the mind tries to force life to match what was imagined. And this creates resistance. That resistance is felt as stress, as frustration, as a constant sense that things are not going the way they should. But life is not designed to follow a script. It is dynamic, it is unpredictable, it is constantly adjusting. And when the mind insists on fixed outcomes, it goes against that nature. This creates friction. Buddhist wisdom offers a different perspective. It does not reject planning. It does not suggest abandoning responsibility. It simply points out the difference between wise preparation and attachment to outcomes. Wise preparation is flexible. It is based on what can be done now without clinging to what must happen later. It allows for change. It accepts that things may unfold differently. It is rooted in the present. Controlling planning is rigid. It is based on needing the future to match expectations. It resists change. It creates pressure. It is rooted in fear. The difference is subtle but important. One creates clarity. The other creates tension. When this difference is understood, something shifts. Planning becomes lighter. It is no longer a way to control life. It becomes a way to support action without becoming attached to results. The mind starts to trust that it does not need to predict everything to be okay. It begins to accept that uncertainty is part of life, that not everything can be known in advance, and that this is not a problem. This acceptance brings relief, because the pressure to figure everything out begins to fade. The mind becomes quieter, more present, more open to what is actually happening, and in that openness, there is more clarity than planning could ever provide. Because clarity does not come from controlling the future. It comes from being fully aware in the present. When the mind is here, it can respond more naturally, more effectively, without the burden of trying to force outcomes. This creates a different kind of confidence, not the confidence that comes from having everything planned, but the confidence that comes from being able to handle whatever arises. This is real stability, not dependent on plans, not dependent on certainty, but rooted in awareness. As this illusion of control through planning begins to dissolve, another pattern becomes visible, because even when planning fades, there is still something the mind holds on to very tightly, a deep attachment, not just to preparation, but to outcomes themselves. And this is where the next layer begins to reveal itself. As the illusion of control through planning begins to loosen, something deeper quietly comes into view. Even when the plans are dropped, even when the mind tries to stay present, there is still a pull, a subtle but powerful force that keeps the mind tied to the future. It is not the plan anymore, it is the result. And this is where the next layer reveals itself. There is a quiet tension that appears the moment the heart says, "This must happen." It does not shout, it does not always feel urgent, but it sits there beneath the surface, shaping how you feel, how you think, and how you experience every moment. It is the craving for a specific outcome. It begins very subtly. You take an action, and along with that action comes an expectation, a picture of how things should turn out, a desired result that feels important, sometimes even necessary. At first it feels natural, it feels like direction, like purpose, but slowly, without being noticed, something changes. The action is no longer enough. Now the result becomes everything, and this is where attachment is born. The mind starts to link its sense of peace to whether that outcome happens or not. It begins to say, without saying it directly, "I will feel okay when this works out. I will relax when this goes my way. I will be at ease when this result appears." And just like that, peace is moved into the future. It is no longer here, it is waiting. This creates a silent dependency. Now every moment leading up to that outcome carries pressure. There is a constant evaluation. Is it working? Is it getting closer? Is it going in the right direction? And if the answer is unclear, the mind becomes restless. If things seem to be going well, there is temporary relief. But even that relief is unstable because it depends on the outcome continuing to move in the desired direction. So the mind watches closely. It holds on. It does not relax. This is the hidden nature of craving. It does not always feel like desire. Sometimes it feels like hope. Sometimes it feels like motivation. Sometimes it feels like commitment. But underneath all of it, there is attachment. An emotional dependence on something that has not yet happened. And this dependence creates tension, because the outcome is not in your control. No matter how much effort is applied, no matter how much attention is given, the result depends on many factors. Other people, changing conditions, timing, and countless variables that cannot be fully managed. And the mind knows this, even if it does not admit it. so it becomes anxious. It tries to secure the outcome by thinking more, by doing more, by holding on tighter. But this does not create certainty. It only creates more movement, more tension, more attachment. There is also a deeper layer to this craving. The outcome is not just something you want. It becomes something you believe you need. It starts to carry meaning about who you are. If it happens, it confirms something about you. It validates you. It gives you a sense of worth, success, or belonging. If it does not happen, it feels like a loss, not just of the outcome, but of what it represents. This is why certain results feel so heavy. It is not just about the situation, it is about identity. The mind attaches meaning to outcomes. It turns them into reflections of self. So when the outcome is uncertain, the sense of self feels uncertain, and that creates deeper discomfort. The mind then becomes even more invested. It needs the result, not just to achieve something, but to feel complete. And this creates a powerful form of attachment, because now the outcome is not optional. It becomes necessary for emotional stability. But this is where suffering grows. Because the more necessary the outcome feels, the more fragile peace becomes. Every delay feels heavier, every obstacle feels more threatening. Every sign that things might not go as planned creates fear, and even when the outcome is achieved, the peace that follows is temporary, because the mind quickly moves to the next desire, the next outcome, the next thing that needs to happen. So the cycle continues. This is why craving is described in Buddhist teaching as one of the strongest causes of suffering, not because desire itself is wrong, but because of the attachment that comes with it. The belief that happiness depends on something outside of the present moment. The belief that peace is waiting somewhere in the future, tied to a specific result. This belief keeps the mind in a constant state of reaching, always moving forward, always looking ahead, never fully arriving. There is also the emotional instability that comes with this pattern. When the mind is attached to outcomes, emotions become dependent on progress. If things seem to be going well, there is excitement, hope, even joy. If things become uncertain, there is worry, doubt, tension. If things go wrong, there is disappointment, frustration, sometimes even despair. So the emotional state is constantly shifting, not because of what is happening in the present, but because of how the future is imagined. This creates a lack of grounding. The mind is not stable, it is moving with every perceived change in direction, and this movement creates exhaustion, because it never stops. There is always something at stake, something to gain, something to lose, and as long as the mind is tied to outcomes, it cannot fully rest, because it is always waiting for something to happen before it allows itself to be at peace. This waiting becomes a habit, a way of living, a constant postponement of contentment. But what is rarely seen is that the outcome itself does not contain peace. The peace that seems to come from achieving something is actually the temporary release of craving. For a moment, the mind stops wanting. For a moment, it is satisfied. And in that moment, there is peace. But the mind does not recognize this. It thinks the peace came from the outcome. So it starts chasing the next one, not realizing that it is chasing the same temporary release over and over again. This is the illusion. The outcome is not the source of peace. The absence of craving is. And when this is seen clearly, something begins to shift. The relationship with outcomes starts to change. They are no longer seen as sources of identity or emotional stability. They become simply results. Things that may happen or may not happen. Things that can be worked toward but not clung to. This does not remove action. It does not remove effort. It removes attachment. It allows action to come from clarity, not from need, from presence, not from pressure. The mind begins to act without tying its sense of peace to the result. It becomes more relaxed, more open, more flexible. It can engage fully without being consumed by the outcome. And in that space, something new appears, a quiet sense of ease, because the weight of needing things to go a certain way begins to lift. The future is no longer something to control or secure. It becomes something to meet moment by moment. And this changes the entire experience of life. Because now the present is no longer a means to an end. It becomes enough on its own. This is where real peace begins to grow. Not from achieving specific outcomes, but from releasing the need for them to define how you feel. And as this attachment to outcomes becomes clearer, something even deeper begins to reveal itself. Because underneath the craving, there is something else, something that gives it its intensity, a deeper force that drives the need to control, to plan, and to attach. And understanding that force opens the next door. As the attachment to outcomes begins to loosen, something deeper starts to come into focus. It becomes clear that the craving was never just about the result. It was protecting something. It was trying to avoid something. Beneath the need for things to go a certain way, there is a quieter force, one that has been there all along. It is not control itself that drives the struggle. It is what control is trying to keep away. And this is where everything becomes more honest. There is a kind of discomfort that is not always easy to face. It does not come with clear words. It does not always explain itself, but it sits underneath thoughts, underneath reactions, underneath the constant effort to manage life. It is fear, not loud fear, not always visible fear, but a steady presence that shapes decisions, expectations, and behavior in ways that are rarely questioned. The need to control does not begin as strength. It begins as protection. Somewhere along the way, the mind learned that certain experiences are painful. Loss hurts. Rejection stings. Embarrassment lingers. Disappointment leaves a heavy feeling. Powerlessness feels unbearable. These experiences leave impressions, not always dramatic, but deep enough to be remembered. And once they are remembered, the mind begins to organize itself around avoiding them. This is where control begins. It is not about managing life perfectly. It is about trying to avoid feeling certain things again. The mind starts to believe that if it can predict outcomes, it can prevent pain. If it can shape situations, it can avoid loss. If it can influence how others respond, it can protect itself from rejection or judgment. So it begins to act. It becomes cautious. It becomes strategic. It becomes careful. And over time, this carefulness turns into a constant effort to control. But underneath that effort is fear. Fear of losing something important. Fear of not being enough. Fear of being exposed. Fear of things falling apart. These fears are rarely acknowledged directly. Instead, they hide behind thoughts like, "I just want things to go right," or "I need to make sure everything is handled." But if those thoughts are looked at closely, there is always something underneath them. A concern about what might happen if things do not go as planned. A worry about how it will feel. A quiet resistance to discomfort. This resistance is what fuels control. The mind does not trust life to unfold without pain, so it tries to manage it. But life cannot be managed in that way. Pain is part of being human. Loss happens. Disappointment happens. Situations do not always go as expected, and no amount of control can completely prevent that. This creates a difficult situation for the mind. It is trying to avoid something that cannot be fully avoided, and this creates tension. Because the effort never ends. There is always something to monitor, something to prepare for, something to guard against. This constant guarding becomes exhausting, but the mind does not easily let go of it, because it believes that if it stops, something bad will happen. This belief is strong. It feels real. Even when there is no immediate threat, the possibility of future discomfort keeps the system active. There is also the fear of losing control itself. Control becomes a form of identity. Being the one who manages things, who keeps everything together, who stays ahead of problems. Letting go of control can feel like stepping into vulnerability. It can feel like exposure, like removing a layer of protection that has been relied on for a long time. This makes it difficult to release, because it is not just a habit. It feels like safety. But this safety is limited. It only works as long as things remain within certain boundaries. The moment life moves outside those boundaries, the sense of control weakens and the fear returns, sometimes even stronger. There is also a fear of not knowing how to handle what comes. If control is dropped, the mind wonders, what happens then? What if something difficult arises? What if there is pain? What if there is loss? What if there is nothing to hold on to? These questions create hesitation. They keep the mind attached to control, because control feels like preparation. It feels like readiness. But true readiness is different. It does not come from trying to avoid every possible outcome. It comes from the ability to face whatever arises without collapsing. This is where Buddhist understanding brings clarity. It does not suggest eliminating fear completely. It does not suggest becoming indifferent to life. It suggests seeing fear clearly, understanding it, noticing how it shapes behavior, and recognizing that control is often just a response to that fear. When fear is seen directly, without immediately reacting to it, something begins to change. The mind starts to realize that fear is not always a signal of danger. Sometimes it is just a memory, a pattern, a learned response. And when it is not fed, it begins to lose its intensity. This does not happen instantly, but gradually. The mind becomes more willing to stay with discomfort instead of trying to escape it. It begins to trust that feelings can be experienced without needing to control everything around them. This creates a different kind of strength, not the strength of holding everything together, but the strength of being able to remain present, even when things are uncertain, even when things are uncomfortable, even when things do not go as planned. This presence changes the relationship with fear. Fear is no longer something that needs to be eliminated. It becomes something that can be observed, felt, allowed, without being turned into action, without being turned into control, and in that space, something unexpected happens. The fear begins to soften, not because it is pushed away, but because it is no longer being resisted. This is a subtle shift, but it is powerful, because it breaks the cycle where fear leads to control, and control leads to more fear. Now there is space between them, a moment where the mind can choose, not to react automatically, not to tighten, not to control, but simply to be. This moment is small at first, but it grows. And as it grows, the need to control begins to weaken, because the mind starts to trust something new. Not certainty, not predictability, but its own ability to stay present, regardless of what happens. This trust is not built through planning. It is built through experience, through seeing that uncertainty can be lived with, that discomfort can be held, that life can unfold without needing to be forced. And this trust brings a different kind of peace, a deeper one that is not dependent on outcomes or plans or control, but rooted in presence, rooted in acceptance, rooted in the understanding that fear does not need to run the system. Now, as this deeper layer of fear becomes clearer, another pattern begins to emerge. Because even when fear is present, the mind still tries to deal with it in a very specific way. It tries to manage time itself, to speed things up, to delay things, to revisit what has already happened. And this creates another form of subtle suffering that often goes unnoticed. As fear begins to loosen its grip, the mind does not immediately become still. It looks for another way to protect itself, another way to regain a sense of control. And without even noticing, it turns towards something that feels invisible but powerful: time. It begins to move through it, shape it, chase it, resist it, and replay it, all in an attempt to feel safe again. And this is where a deeper layer of suffering quietly takes hold. There is a tension that comes not from what is happening, but from when it is happening. A subtle discomfort that appears when the present moment does not feel like the right moment. Something feels delayed, or too fast, or out of place. The mind begins to interfere. It tries to rush what has not yet arrived. It tries to hold on to what is already fading. It tries to rewrite what has already passed. And in doing so, it loses touch with the only moment that actually exists. The present. There is a restless urge to move ahead of life. The mind looks at where things are and immediately compares it to where they should be. It creates a gap between now and later, and then it tries to close that gap as quickly as possible. This creates pressure, a sense that things need to happen faster, that progress is too slow, that time is slipping away. So the mind pushes forward. It starts thinking about future outcomes, future conversations, future possibilities. It rehearses, predicts, prepares. It tries to arrive before life has unfolded. But this movement creates strain, because the future is not here, and trying to live inside it requires effort. The body stays in the present, but the mind moves ahead. This split creates tension, a feeling of being stretched between two places at once. The more the mind rushes, the more the present feels like an obstacle instead of a place to live. Moments become things to get through. Tasks become steps towards something else. Nothing feels complete on its own. Everything is part of a larger timeline that never seems to arrive. This is one way the mind tries to control time, by trying to speed it up. But there is another side to this. There are moments the mind does not want to move forward, moments it resists, moments it wishes would disappear or change before they are fully experienced. Uncomfortable feelings, uncertain situations, difficult conversations. In these moments, the mind pushes back. It becomes tense. It tries to escape. It wants the moment to pass quickly, to be replaced by something easier, something more comfortable. This creates resistance, a feeling of being stuck, not because time has stopped, but because the mind is fighting what is happening. This fight creates suffering, because the moment continues regardless of resistance. The more the mind pushes against it, the heavier it feels. This is the second way the mind tries to control time, by trying to avoid the present. There is also a third movement. The mind goes backward. It returns to what has already happened. It replays conversations, decisions, actions. It analyzes them, questions them, tries to understand what could have been different. It creates alternate versions of the past. Better responses, better outcomes, better choices. This feels like reflection, but often it becomes something else. It becomes an attempt to change what cannot be changed. This creates a different kind of tension, a feeling of being trapped in something that has already ended. The body is here, but the mind is somewhere else, trying to fix what is no longer real. This replaying can be subtle, a thought here, a memory there, but it can also become intense, a loop that repeats again and again, each time bringing the same emotions: regret, frustration, guilt. The mind believes that if it can understand it enough, if it can think it through completely, it can find closure. But thinking does not change the past. It only keeps it active. This is the third way the mind tries to control time, by trying to reshape what has already happened. All three movements share something in common. They move away from the present. They create a sense that peace exists somewhere else, in the future, in a different version of now, in a corrected version of the past. But peace does not exist in those places, because those places are not real. They are mental constructions. The mind spends energy trying to control time because it believes time holds the answer. If the future can be secured, everything will be okay. If the present can be improved, everything will be okay. If the past can be resolved, everything will be okay. But this belief keeps the mind in constant motion, always reaching, always adjusting, always trying to fix something that is not actually broken. This creates a subtle exhaustion, not from physical activity, but from mental movement. The mind rarely rests. Even in silence, it is active, moving through time, trying to shape it, trying to control it. But time cannot be controlled. It moves on its own. It does not speed up because the mind wants it to. It does not slow down because the mind resists it. It does not change because the mind replays it. This creates a conflict. The mind tries to control something that is not responsive to control. And this conflict creates suffering. Buddhist understanding brings a different perspective. It points out that the problem is not time itself. It is the relationship with it. The mind treats time as something that needs to be managed. But time is simply movement, moments arising and passing, without needing interference. When the mind stops trying to control time, something begins to shift. The present moment becomes clearer, not as something to escape, but as something to experience. There is less urgency, less resistance, less replaying. The mind begins to settle, not because everything is resolved, but because it is no longer trying to resolve everything across time. It starts to see that the present moment is not incomplete. It does not need to be rushed or changed. It is already enough as it is. This does not mean life becomes passive. Action still happens. Decisions still happen. But they arise from presence, not from pressure, from clarity, not from fear. This creates a different experience of time. It feels more spacious, less compressed. Moments are no longer just steps towards something else. They become complete in themselves. There is less need to get somewhere, less need to fix something, less need to go back. And in that space, the mind begins to rest. Not because time has changed, but because the need to control it has softened. This rest is subtle, but it is real. It is not dependent on how fast things move or how slow. It is not dependent on what has happened or what will happen. It is simply the absence of resistance, and in that absence, peace begins to deepen. Not as something created, but as something uncovered, something that was always present, hidden beneath the movement of the mind through time. Now, as this relationship with time becomes clearer, another insight begins to emerge. Because if the mind cannot control time, and cannot control outcomes, and cannot control uncertainty, then something deeper must be shaping how life unfolds. Something beyond individual effort, something beyond personal will. And understanding that begins to shift the entire perspective. As the struggle with time begins to soften, a deeper realization starts to rise. The mind slowly sees that it cannot control the past, cannot rush the future, and cannot fully shape the present. And yet, life continues to move, events continue to unfold, and outcomes continue to arise. This brings a quiet but powerful question. If everything is happening but not fully under personal control, then what is actually guiding the way life unfolds? And this is where a deeper truth begins to reveal itself. There is a hidden complexity behind every moment that is rarely seen. Life does not move in straight lines. It does not follow a single intention, a single plan, or a single effort. Every event, every situation, every outcome is the result of countless influences coming together at once. These influences are not always visible. Some are close, some are far. Some are recent, some are rooted deep in the past. They move silently, shaping reality in ways the mind cannot fully track. This is what Buddhist wisdom calls causes and conditions. Nothing happens on its own. Nothing exists independently. Every moment is the result of many things coming together. A conversation is not just words. It is mood, timing, past experiences, expectations, environment, and unseen emotional currents. A decision is not just choice. It is influenced by memory, belief, fear, desire, and countless subtle forces that are not always recognized. Even something as simple as how you feel in a moment is not created by one cause. It is shaped by sleep, food, thoughts, interactions, memories, and conditions you may not even be aware of. Life is not a straight path, it is a web, and every thread in that web is connected to others. When this is not understood, the mind takes things personally. It believes that everything that happens is a direct result of its own actions or its own control. If something goes well, it feels responsible. If something goes wrong, it feels at fault. This creates pressure because it assumes that life should be manageable, that with enough effort, enough awareness, enough control, everything can be directed in a certain way. But when causes and conditions are seen clearly, this belief begins to soften because it becomes clear that no single person is in control of the entire web. There are too many factors, too many influences, too many moving parts. This does not mean that your actions do not matter. They do, but they are part of a much larger system. They are one influence among many, and this changes the way responsibility is experienced. It becomes lighter, more realistic, less burdened by the need to control everything. There is also a deeper sense of humility that begins to arise, not as a forced attitude, but as a natural understanding, because it becomes clear that life is not centered around one perspective, one will, or one intention. Everything is interconnected. Everything is influenced by everything else. Success is not only personal effort, it is also timing, support, opportunity, environment, and countless unseen conditions aligning. Failure is not only personal fault, it is also circumstances, external factors and influences beyond immediate control. This understanding removes the harshness of self-judgment. It softens the need to blame. It creates space for compassion, because just as your life is shaped by many conditions, so is the life of others. Their actions, their choices, their behavior all arise from their own web of causes and conditions. This changes the way you see people. Less judgment, more understanding. Less expectation, more acceptance. It becomes easier to see that not everything is personal, that people act based on what they know, what they feel, what they have experienced. And just like you, they are navigating a complex system they do not fully control. This brings a different kind of peace, not because everything is perfect, but because the need to control everything begins to dissolve. There is also a sense of relief that comes with this understanding, because the burden of holding everything together begins to lift. The mind no longer feels like it has to manage every detail of life. It begins to trust that things are unfolding through many influences, not just personal effort. This does not remove action. It changes the way action is taken. Instead of acting from pressure, from fear, from the need to control outcomes, action begins to arise from clarity, from awareness of what can be done now, without clinging to what must happen later. This creates a different relationship with effort. Effort becomes focused, present, free from the weight of needing to guarantee results. There is also a deeper acceptance that begins to form, not as resignation, but as understanding. Understanding that life cannot be reduced to simple cause and effect from a single perspective. That outcomes are not always predictable. That results are not always immediate. And that this is not a problem, it is simply how reality works. When this is accepted, the mind becomes more flexible, more open to change, less attached to fixed expectations. It becomes easier to adapt, to respond, to move with life instead of against it. This creates a sense of flow, not because everything is controlled, but because there is less resistance, less friction, less struggle. There is also a shift in how uncertainty is experienced. It no longer feels like something that needs to be eliminated. It becomes something that is natural. Because if life is shaped by countless causes and conditions, then not knowing everything is part of the process. Clarity comes when conditions allow it. Understanding comes when it is ready, and trying to force it only creates tension. This creates patience, a willingness to allow things to unfold, without rushing, without forcing, without needing immediate answers. And in that patience, there is calm, because the mind is no longer trying to control the entire web. It is simply participating in it. There is also a deeper sense of connection that begins to emerge, because when life is seen as interconnected, there is less separation, less sense of being alone, isolated, or solely responsible. Everything is part of a larger movement. Everything is influenced by everything else. This creates a sense of belonging, not in a social sense, but in an existential sense, a feeling that you are part of something larger, something flowing, something alive. And in that sense, there is ease, because the need to control everything begins to feel unnecessary. There is trust, not blind trust, but a quiet confidence that life is unfolding through processes that do not need constant interference. This trust is not based on certainty. It is based on understanding. Understanding that not everything needs to be known or controlled in order for things to move forward. This changes the entire experience of life, because now, instead of trying to dominate reality, there is a willingness to cooperate with it, to act where action is possible, to let go where control is not possible, to trust the unfolding without needing to define every step. And in that cooperation, something very different appears. A sense of harmony. Not perfect harmony, but a natural alignment. A feeling that things are moving, not against you, but through a larger process that includes you. And in that feeling, there is peace. Not because everything is controlled, but because the need to control has softened. Now, as this understanding of causes and conditions becomes clearer, another layer begins to reveal itself, because even with this awareness, there is still something the mind resists deeply, something it struggles to accept. The fact that everything is always changing, that nothing stays the same. And this resistance opens the next door. As the truth of causes and conditions begins to settle in, a deeper layer quietly comes into view. It becomes clear that life is not only shaped by many forces, but also constantly moving, constantly shifting, constantly becoming something new. Nothing stays fixed. And this is where the mind begins to struggle again. Because even if control over events starts to loosen, there is still a deep resistance to something more fundamental, change itself. And this is where the next understanding begins. There is a quiet discomfort that appears the moment something begins to fade. It does not matter what it is. A feeling, a relationship, a phase of life, a sense of certainty. The moment it starts to shift, something inside reacts. It wants to hold it, to keep it, to make it stay. This reaction is so natural that it often goes unnoticed. It feels like care. It feels like importance. It feels like meaning. But underneath it, there is resistance. Resistance to impermanence. The mind does not like things ending. It does not like things changing. It does not like things becoming uncertain or unfamiliar. It prefers stability. It prefers continuity. It prefers what it can recognize and return to. So when life begins to move, the mind tries to slow it down. When something feels good, it wants it to last. When something feels painful, it wants it to disappear quickly. In both cases, there is the same pattern, a refusal to allow things to be as they are. This is where control becomes deeply connected to impermanence. Because control is an attempt to stop change. It is an effort to freeze reality in a way that feels comfortable. But reality does not stay still. Everything is in motion. Every moment arises and passes. Every experience comes and goes. Every situation changes, even if slowly. And this movement cannot be stopped. Yet the mind keeps trying. It tries to hold on to pleasant experiences, to recreate them, to extend them. It tries to avoid unpleasant ones, to shorten them, to escape them. But both efforts create tension, because they go against the natural flow of life. There is also a deeper layer to this resistance. It is not just about external things changing, it is about the self. Because if everything is changing, then the idea of a fixed self becomes unstable. The identity the mind holds onto, the sense of who you are, is also subject to change. Thoughts change, feelings change, beliefs change, even the sense of identity shifts over time. This creates discomfort, because the ego wants something solid, something stable, something that does not move. So it creates a story, a sense of continuity, a belief that there is a fixed me that remains the same, and then it tries to protect that story. But impermanence challenges it. It shows that everything is fluid, that nothing stays exactly the same. And this feels threatening, so the mind resists. It tries to define itself more clearly, to hold on to certain traits, roles, identities, to reinforce a sense of stability. But this effort creates tension, because the reality underneath is always changing. This is why control becomes stronger in moments of transition, when something is ending, when something new is beginning, when life shifts in ways that are not predictable. These moments highlight impermanence, and the mind reacts by trying to regain stability. It tightens, it holds on, it tries to control what is happening. But this only increases the discomfort, because the change continues, no matter how much effort is applied. This creates a sense of struggle, a feeling of being out of sync with life, of trying to move in one direction while life moves in another. And this creates suffering, not because change is painful by itself, but because of the resistance to it. There is also a subtle sadness that comes from this resistance, a sense of loss even before something has fully ended, because the mind anticipates the change. It sees that something will not last, and it reacts by trying to hold on to it more tightly. But this tightness creates its own discomfort. It prevents full enjoyment, because there is always a background awareness that it might end. So instead of fully experiencing the moment, the mind is partially focused on preserving it. This splits the experience. It creates distance, and that distance reduces the depth of the moment. This is one of the quiet costs of resisting impermanence. It takes away the fullness of what is here. Because the mind is not fully present, it is partly attached to keeping things the same. There is also the fear of what comes after change. If something ends, what will replace it? If a situation shifts, what will happen next? If an identity changes, who will you be? These questions create uncertainty, and uncertainty brings the mind back to fear. So it tries to avoid the change altogether. It tries to maintain the current state, even if that state is not ideal, because at least it is known. This creates stagnation, a resistance to growth, a hesitation to move forward, because movement means change, and change feels uncomfortable. But life continues to move anyway, so the mind becomes caught between holding on and being pulled forward, and this creates tension. The deeper understanding in Buddhist teaching is that impermanence is not a problem. It is the nature of reality. Everything that arises will pass. Everything that exists will change. Everything that is experienced will shift. This is not something to be fixed. It is something to be understood. When this is seen clearly, the relationship with change begins to shift. Instead of resisting it, there is a willingness to observe it, to allow it, to move with it. This does not mean liking every change. It does not mean being indifferent. It means not fighting the fact that change is happening. This reduces tension, because the mind is no longer pushing against reality, it is aligning with it. There is also a different kind of appreciation that begins to appear. Because when impermanence is accepted, moments are seen differently. They are not expected to last forever. They are recognized as temporary. And this recognition creates a sense of value, a deeper presence, a willingness to experience fully without needing to hold on. This creates richness because the moment is no longer seen as something to keep, but something to experience. And this changes everything, because the fear of losing it decreases, and the ability to be with it increases. There is also a sense of release, because the pressure to maintain everything begins to fade. The mind no longer feels responsible for keeping things the same. It no longer feels the need to control every change. It begins to trust the flow, not blindly, but with understanding. Understanding that change is not something that needs to be managed. It is something that is already happening. And allowing it does not create loss. It creates freedom. Freedom from the constant effort to hold things together. Freedom from the fear of things falling apart. Freedom from the illusion that stability must be forced. This freedom brings a quiet peace, not dependent on things staying the same, but grounded in the ability to move with change, to adapt, to respond, without losing balance. And in that balance, there is calm. Now, as this resistance to impermanence becomes clearer, another pattern begins to reveal itself. Because even though life is always changing, there is still a strong tendency to focus on something very specific. How others react, how others see, how others respond. And this creates another layer of subtle control that often goes unnoticed. As the resistance to change begins to soften, another layer quietly reveals itself. Even when life is allowed to move, even when impermanence is understood, there is still something the mind tries to hold steady. Not situations, not time, but people. Because no matter how much changes are accepted, there remains a deep pull to control something more personal. How others see you, how they respond to you, how they feel about you. And this is where a different kind of exhaustion begins. There is a quiet pressure that comes from wanting to be seen in a certain way. It does not always show itself clearly, but it shapes behavior, words, and even silence. It appears in small adjustments, in careful choices, in the subtle filtering of what is said and what is held back. This pressure does not come from others alone. It comes from the need to manage their reactions. There is a belief that if you act correctly, speak correctly, present yourself in the right way, you can influence how people perceive you. You can avoid judgment. You can maintain approval. You can protect relationships. At first, this seems reasonable. It feels like social awareness. It feels like emotional intelligence. But over time, something begins to change. The awareness turns into vigilance. The flexibility turns into calculation. And the connection with others becomes something to manage rather than something to experience. This is where the exhaustion begins, because people are not fixed. Their thoughts shift. Their emotions change. Their reactions are influenced by their own causes and conditions, their own experiences, their own inner world. And none of that is fully visible. So trying to control how they respond becomes an endless task. There is always something unknown, something unpredictable, something that cannot be fully managed. And yet, the mind keeps trying. It analyzes expressions. It reads between the lines. It replays conversations, looking for signs. Did that come out wrong? Did they misunderstand? Do they see me differently now? These questions repeat quietly, creating a background noise that rarely stops. Even when the interaction is over, the mind continues. It revisits moments. It adjusts them. It imagines better versions, better words, better timing, all in an attempt to shape how the interaction is remembered. But this effort does not bring peace. It creates more tension, because it is based on something that cannot be controlled. Another person's perception. There is also a deeper layer to this pattern, the need to be accepted. to be liked, to be understood. These needs are natural, but when they become tied to control, they create pressure. Because now, every interaction carries weight. It is no longer just a moment. It becomes a test, a chance to succeed or fail in how you are perceived. This changes the way you show up. It creates self-consciousness, a constant awareness of how you might be seen. And this awareness can become heavy, because it is not just about being present, it is about being evaluated, not only by others, but by yourself. You begin to monitor your own behavior, to check if it aligns with how you want to be seen. This creates a split. One part of the mind is acting, another part is watching, judging, adjusting. This split takes energy. It creates fatigue, because you are not just living the moment. You are managing it, trying to control its outcome. And because the outcome depends on others, the effort never feels complete. There is always uncertainty. Did they like it? Did they understand? Did it go well? And because these questions cannot always be answered clearly, the mind keeps searching. This searching becomes exhausting. There is also the fear of negative reactions, fear of judgment, fear of rejection, fear of being misunderstood. These fears amplify the need to control because they create the belief that something must be done to prevent those outcomes. So the mind becomes more careful, more guarded, more controlled. But this control limits authenticity. It creates distance. Because instead of expressing freely, you begin to shape your expression based on how it might be received. This can make interactions feel less real, less connected, more calculated. And over time, this creates a subtle dissatisfaction, because even when approval is gained, it does not feel complete. There is always a question. Was that really me? Or was that a version of me designed to be accepted? This creates a quiet disconnection from others and from yourself. There is also the burden of trying to maintain relationships through control, trying to keep others happy, trying to avoid conflict, trying to ensure that everything stays smooth. This effort can become overwhelming because relationships are dynamic. They involve two people, each with their own thoughts, feelings, and changes. Trying to manage both sides creates strain, because you are taking responsibility for something that is not entirely yours. This leads to emotional exhaustion, a feeling of being drained after interactions, not because of what happened, but because of the effort involved in managing it. This is often misunderstood. It is not always the interaction that is tiring. It is the control, the constant monitoring, the constant adjusting, the constant trying to influence something that cannot be fully controlled. There is also the disappointment that comes when control fails, when someone reacts differently than expected, when they misunderstand, when they judge, when they respond in ways that cannot be managed. This can feel personal because effort was applied, care was taken, and yet the outcome did not match. This creates frustration, sometimes even resentment, because it feels like something went wrong. But nothing went wrong. It is simply the nature of people. They respond based on their own conditions, not based on your effort to control their response. This understanding can be difficult at first, because it requires letting go of the belief that you can shape how others see you. But when it is accepted, something begins to shift. The pressure starts to ease, because the responsibility becomes clearer. You are responsible for your actions, not for how others interpret them. You are responsible for your intentions, not for how others receive them. This creates space, because the focus returns to what is within reach, what can be done now, without the burden of controlling outcomes. There is also a deeper sense of freedom that begins to appear, because without the need to manage reactions, you can show up more naturally, more honestly, without constant adjustment. This does not mean ignoring others. It means relating without trying to control, listening without needing to shape, speaking without needing to secure a specific response. This creates more genuine connection because it removes the layer of calculation. It allows interactions to unfold more naturally, and in that natural flow, there is less tension, less exhaustion. There is also a shift in how judgment is experienced. When you stop trying to control how others see you, their opinions lose some of their weight, not because they do not matter at all, but because they are no longer tied to your sense of peace. They become perspectives, not definitions, and this creates stability because your state is no longer dependent on external approval. It becomes more grounded, more consistent, less reactive. This does not happen all at once, but gradually. As the need to control reactions weakens, the mind becomes quieter, less focused on managing impressions, more focused on being present. And in that presence, something important happens. The energy that was used to control becomes available for awareness, for clarity, for connection, without the strain, without the pressure. And this creates a different experience of relationships, one that is lighter, more open, more real. Now, as this exhaustion from managing others begins to fade, another layer becomes visible. Because even when the need to control people's reactions is released, there is still something the mind holds on to, a deeper expectation. A belief that life itself must unfold in a certain way before peace is allowed, and this belief opens the next door. As the need to manage how others see you begins to fade, something quieter and more hidden starts to come into view. Even without the pressure of controlling reactions, there is still a condition the mind holds on to very tightly. A quiet rule that says peace is allowed, but only after everything turns out right. And this is where another layer begins to open. There is a silent agreement the mind makes with life. It does not always speak it clearly, but it lives by it. It says, "I will relax when this works out. I will feel okay when things finally fall into place. I will breathe when life becomes what I expect it to be." Until then, something remains held back. A part of you waits. There is a subtle tension that does not come from what is happening, but from what has not yet happened. A feeling that something is incomplete, that something is missing, that something still needs to be fixed before you can fully let go. This is the fantasy of perfect outcomes. It is not always dramatic. It can be very simple, a conversation going exactly right, a plan unfolding without resistance, a relationship staying stable, a future arriving in a clear and satisfying way. These expectations create a picture, and the mind holds on to that picture. It begins to compare reality to it. Every moment becomes a measurement. Is this how it should be? Is this close enough? Is this moving in the right direction? If the answer feels positive, there is temporary ease. If it does not, tension appears. This creates a condition for peace. Peace becomes something that depends on alignment. Alignment between reality and expectation. But reality does not follow expectation perfectly. There are always differences, small ones, large ones, unpredictable ones. And because of this, peace becomes unstable. It comes and goes. Not because life is unstable, but because the conditions for peace are too strict. The mind is waiting for perfection, but perfection is an idea, not a living experience. Life does not arrive in one fixed form. It moves, it adjusts, it shifts in ways that cannot be fully controlled or predicted. So when the mind demands that life match a specific image, it creates resistance, a quiet rejection of what is actually happening. This rejection creates tension, because the present moment is being compared to something else, something imagined, something that does not exist yet. And in that comparison, the present loses its value. It becomes something to get through, something to fix, something to improve, instead of something to experience. This creates a constant sense of waiting, waiting for things to be right, waiting for conditions to align, waiting for a future that feels complete. But while waiting, life continues. Moments pass, experiences unfold, opportunities for presence appear and disappear, and they are missed. Not because they are not there, but because the mind is focused on something else, something better, something more complete. This is the cost of holding on to perfect outcomes. It takes attention away from what is here. There is also a deeper layer to this pattern, the belief that certain outcomes will bring lasting peace. That once things are resolved, once everything falls into place, the mind will finally settle. But this belief is not accurate, because even when things go as planned, the peace that follows is temporary. The mind enjoys it for a moment. Then it moves on. It finds something else that needs to be improved, something else that needs to be controlled, something else that must happen. This creates an endless cycle. Peace is always postponed, always tied to the next outcome, never fully allowed in the present. This is not because peace is unavailable, it is because it is being delayed. The mind keeps placing it in the future, attaching it to conditions that are constantly changing. This creates a subtle frustration, a feeling that something is always just out of reach, even when things are going well, even when nothing is obviously wrong. There is still a sense that something is missing. And that missing feeling is not coming from reality. It is coming from expectation, from the idea that reality should be more than what it is right now. There is also the fear of accepting things as they are, because acceptance can feel like giving up, like settling, like losing the desire to improve. But this is a misunderstanding. Acceptance is not about stopping action. It is about removing resistance. It is about seeing clearly what is happening without needing it to be different before allowing peace. When acceptance is present, action becomes clearer, more direct, less driven by pressure, less influenced by fear. It becomes a response to reality, not a reaction against it. This creates a different experience, one where effort exists but without tension, where movement happens but without the need to force, where change is allowed but without rejecting the present. This is where the fantasy of perfect outcomes begins to dissolve. Not because goals disappear, not because desires vanish, but because the attachment to them weakens. They are no longer seen as conditions for peace. They become possibilities, things that may happen, things that can be worked toward, but not things that define your state. This creates space, space to breathe, space to be present, space to experience life as it unfolds, rather than waiting for it to match an image. And in that space, something quiet appears, a sense of enoughness, not because everything is perfect, but because the need for perfection has softened. This changes the way moments are experienced. They are no longer judged as incomplete. They are seen as whole, even if they are not ideal. This creates a deeper connection with life, because attention is no longer divided. It is not pulled into the future. It is not trapped in expectation. It is here, with what is happening. And in that presence, there is a kind of peace that does not depend on outcomes. It is not fragile. It does not come and go with circumstances. It is steady, because it is not based on what happens. It is based on the absence of resistance to what happens. There is also a sense of freedom that emerges, because the pressure to make everything right begins to fade. Life no longer feels like something that must be perfected. It becomes something that can be lived, fully, even in its imperfections. This does not mean ignoring challenges. It means facing them without the added burden of needing everything to be flawless. This creates resilience, because the mind is no longer tied to one specific version of how things should be. It becomes more adaptable, more open, more able to move with change. And in that adaptability, there is strength, a quiet strength, not based on control, but on presence. Now, as this fantasy of perfect outcomes begins to dissolve, another layer begins to reveal itself. Because even though the need for perfection weakens, there is still a subtle force that tries to shape life in a very direct way. A force that pushes, pressures, and sometimes fights against reality itself. And understanding that force opens the next door. As the need for perfect outcomes begins to loosen, something deeper and more uncomfortable starts to reveal itself. Even when expectations soften, there is still a force within that pushes, a quiet insistence that things should move faster, align sooner, become something different. It is not always loud. It does not always look aggressive, but it is there, a subtle pressure placed on life itself. And this is where a deeper truth begins to unfold. There is a tension that comes from pushing against what is already happening. It is not always obvious. It can appear as determination, as effort, as persistence. But underneath, there is a refusal to allow things to unfold naturally. This refusal creates friction. Life moves in its own rhythm. Situations develop through their own conditions. People act according to their own understanding. Time unfolds without asking for permission. But the mind does not always accept this. It begins to push, to accelerate, to interfere, to shape things according to what it believes should happen. And in doing so, it creates a quiet form of struggle. This struggle is not visible like physical conflict. It does not break things externally, but internally it creates pressure. It creates resistance. It creates a constant feeling that something needs to change immediately. This is the hidden violence, not violence directed outward, but inward, a kind of force applied to reality. The mind begins to treat life as something that must be controlled, corrected, or improved in order to be acceptable. It pushes situations to resolve faster than they are ready to. It pushes people to behave in ways they are not naturally moving toward. It pushes itself to feel differently, to think differently, to be something other than what it is in that moment. This pushing creates tension, because reality does not always respond, and when it does not, the force increases. There is frustration, impatience, a sense that something is wrong, but nothing is wrong. Life is simply not moving according to the pressure being applied. There is also a deeper layer to this. The mind does not just push external situations. It pushes internal experiences. Uncomfortable emotions are not allowed to be present. Sadness is resisted. Fear is suppressed. Uncertainty is avoided. There is an attempt to replace these feelings with something else, something more acceptable, something more comfortable. But this creates conflict, because emotions are not controlled through force. They arise based on conditions, and when they are pushed away, they do not disappear. They remain, often becoming stronger, more persistent, more difficult to ignore. This creates a sense of inner tension, a feeling of being at odds with yourself, because one part of the mind is experiencing something and another part is rejecting it. This rejection is a form of violence, a refusal to allow what is already there. There is also the force applied to time, the urgency to move forward, to get past the current moment, to arrive somewhere else. This creates a constant sense of impatience. Nothing feels fast enough. Nothing feels complete enough. Everything feels like it should be further along. This creates pressure, because time does not respond to force. It moves as it moves, and trying to push it creates only frustration. There is also the force applied to identity, the idea that you should be different, better, more advanced, more stable, more in control. This creates a constant sense of self-judgment, because the present version of yourself is seen as insufficient, something to improve, something to fix, something to change. But this creates resistance, because it rejects what is already here. It turns growth into pressure. Instead of allowing change to happen, naturally it tries to force it. This creates stress, because change does not happen through force, it happens through understanding, through awareness, through allowing. There is also a deeper cost to this constant forcing. It creates disconnection from life, from others, from yourself, because when you are always pushing, you are not listening, you are not observing, you are not present. You are focused on changing what is happening instead of experiencing it. This creates distance, because connection requires presence. It requires openness. It requires allowing. And forcing removes those qualities. It replaces them with control, with pressure, with resistance. There is also the illusion that force creates results. Sometimes it does. Sometimes pushing leads to outcomes. But those outcomes often come with a cost: stress, fatigue, disconnection. And even when the result is achieved, there is often no lasting peace. Because the method used to achieve it creates ongoing tension. The mind learns to rely on force, so it continues to use it in every situation, in every moment. This creates a life that feels like a constant effort, a constant struggle, because everything becomes something to push through, something to manage, something to control. But life is not meant to be lived that way. There is another way of relating to reality, one that does not rely on force, one that does not create friction, one that works with life rather than against it. Buddhist understanding points to this. It shows that forcing is not necessary, that action can arise without pressure, that movement can happen without resistance, that change can occur without violence. This does not mean passivity. It does not mean doing nothing. It means acting from clarity, not from force. Responding to situations rather than pushing them, allowing things to unfold while still participating. This creates a different experience, one where effort exists but without strain, where progress happens but without tension, where change occurs but without conflict. There is also a deeper sense of trust that begins to develop. Trust that life does not need to be forced in order to move. Trust that conditions will unfold. Trust that not everything needs to be controlled. This trust reduces the need for force, because the mind no longer feels like everything depends on its effort. It begins to relax, to soften, to allow, and in that softness, something shifts. The constant pressure begins to fade. The tension begins to dissolve. The inner conflict begins to quiet. Not because everything is perfect, but because the need to force perfection is no longer present. This creates space, space for awareness, space for presence, space for life to unfold naturally. And in that space, there is peace, not created by control, not achieved through force, but revealed when the struggle ends. Now, as this hidden violence of forcing begins to become clear, another distinction starts to emerge. Because not all effort is the same. There is a way of acting that creates tension, and there is a way of acting that brings clarity. Understanding this difference opens the next step forward. As the pressure to force life begins to soften, something important starts to become visible. It is not that action disappears. It is not that effort becomes unnecessary. Life still requires movement, decisions, and participation. But there is a subtle question that begins to arise. What kind of effort is being used? Because not all effort feels the same. Some effort leaves the mind clear, steady, and grounded. Other effort leaves the mind tense, restless, and drained. And this difference changes everything. There is a kind of effort that feels heavy even before it begins. It carries urgency. It carries pressure. It feels like something must happen, and it must happen in a certain way. This effort is not just about doing something. It is about needing something. The action becomes tied to an outcome. It is no longer free. It is driven by a sense that if this does not work, something is lost, something is at risk. This creates tension in the body, a tightness in the chest, a constant thinking about results, a feeling that rest is not allowed until the task is complete and successful. This is controlling effort. It does not simply act, it clings, it holds on to what should happen, and because it is holding on, it cannot relax. Even while acting, the mind is already somewhere else. It is measuring progress. It is evaluating outcomes. It is worried about what might go wrong. This splits attention. One part is doing, another part is watching, judging, and pushing. This division creates strain. Because the mind is not fully present in the action, it is partly trapped in expectation. And this makes even simple tasks feel heavy. There is also a subtle fear behind this kind of effort. A fear that if control is loosened, things will fall apart. So the mind keeps pushing. It increases effort. It tightens its grip. But this tightening reduces clarity. Because clarity requires space. It requires the ability to see what is happening without distortion. And controlling effort fills that space with urgency, with pressure, with noise. This makes it harder to respond wisely, because reactions become faster, more automatic, more driven by fear than by understanding. There is another kind of effort. It feels different from the beginning. It does not carry the same weight. It is focused, but not tense. It is engaged, but not desperate. It acts because action is needed, not because an outcome must be secured. This is wise effort. It is rooted in clarity, in awareness of the present moment. It sees what can be done, and it does it, without adding extra pressure, without clinging to what should happen next. This effort is steady. It does not rush. It does not hesitate. It moves with what is needed, and when the action is complete, it lets go. It does not continue to hold the result. It does not replay. It does not try to control what comes after. This creates a different experience, one where effort does not lead to exhaustion. Because the mind is not carrying additional weight. It is not holding on to outcomes. It is not pushing against uncertainty. It is simply acting. There is also a deeper trust within wise effort. A trust that not everything depends on personal control. That action is only one part of the process. That results arise from many conditions. This trust allows the mind to relax, even while acting, because it knows that doing what is possible is enough. It does not need to guarantee what is not within reach. This creates freedom. Freedom from the pressure to control everything. Freedom from the fear of failure. Freedom from the constant need to adjust and correct. There is also a difference in how mistakes are experienced. With controlling effort, mistakes feel heavy. They feel like proof that something went wrong, that more control is needed. This creates self-judgment. It increases tension. With wise effort, mistakes are seen differently. They are part of the process. They are information. They show what can be understood more clearly. This reduces fear, because mistakes are no longer threats. They become part of learning. This allows the mind to stay open, to adapt, to respond without shutting down. There is also a difference in how time is experienced. Controlling effort is always looking ahead. It is focused on completion, on reaching a point where everything will finally be resolved. This creates impatience, because the present moment feels incomplete. Wise effort stays with the moment. It does what is needed now, without rushing to the end. This creates presence, because the mind is not divided. It is fully engaged in what is happening. This makes the experience richer, more complete. There is also a difference in energy. Controlling effort drains because it carries extra weight, expectation, fear, pressure. These consume energy, even when nothing is being done. Wise effort conserves energy because it removes unnecessary tension. It uses only what is needed. It does not waste energy on trying to control outcomes. This creates sustainability, the ability to continue without burnout, without exhaustion. There is also a deeper sense of alignment. With controlling effort, there is often a mismatch between what is happening and what the mind wants. This creates resistance. With wise effort, there is alignment with reality. Action arises from what is actually present, not from what is imagined. This reduces friction, because the mind is not pushing against what is. It is working with it. This creates flow, a sense that things are moving naturally, without force, without struggle. There is also a shift in identity. Controlling effort often comes from a need to prove something, to show capability, to maintain an image. This creates pressure, because the action is tied to self-worth. Wise effort does not carry this burden. It acts because action is needed, not because identity is at stake. This creates ease, because the action stands on its own. It does not need to confirm anything about who you are. This reduces attachment, because the result does not define you. It is simply a result. There is also a deeper calm that comes with wise effort, because the mind is not constantly evaluating, not constantly pushing. It can settle, even while acting. This calm does not depend on success. It is present regardless of outcome, because it is not tied to outcome. This is where real stability begins, not in controlling results, but in how action is taken. There is also a sense of completeness. With controlling effort, there is always something unfinished, something that could be improved, something that needs more attention. With wise effort, each action is complete in itself. It is done fully, without holding on to it afterward. This creates closure, a sense that nothing is left hanging. This allows the mind to move on, to rest, to be present again. There is also a deeper understanding that begins to form, that life does not require constant control, that action can be effective without being forced, that clarity leads to better outcomes than pressure. This understanding changes the approach to everything: work, relationships, decisions. It becomes less about controlling and more about responding, less about forcing and more about allowing. This creates a different kind of strength, not the strength of pushing harder, but the strength of being steady, clear, present, and this strength brings peace. Not because everything is perfect, but because the way of engaging with life is no longer creating unnecessary suffering. Now, as this distinction between effort becomes clearer, another layer begins to reveal itself. Because even with wise effort, there can still be a subtle attachment, a belief that you must be the one holding everything together, that you must be the one fixing everything. And understanding this belief opens the next step forward. As effort becomes clearer, and the difference between forcing and flowing begins to settle, something deeper quietly steps forward. Even when action is calm, even when the mind is no longer pushing as hard, there can still be a hidden weight, a quiet belief that says, if I don't handle this, everything will fall apart. And this belief holds more power than it first appears. There is a subtle identity that forms around being the one who fixes things. It does not always show itself clearly, but it shapes how you move through life. You become the one who steps in, who solves problems, who keeps situations from breaking. At first, this feels like strength. It feels like reliability. It feels like purpose. But over time, it becomes something else. It becomes a role you cannot easily step out of. There is a quiet satisfaction in being needed, in being the one people turn to when things go wrong. It gives a sense of importance, a sense of value, a feeling that you matter because you can fix what others cannot. This feeling is powerful, but it can also become a trap. Because once your sense of worth becomes tied to fixing things, you begin to carry more than what is yours. You begin to take responsibility for situations that are not fully within your control. You begin to step into roles that were never meant to be permanent, and slowly the line between helping and holding everything together begins to blur. There is a constant readiness that develops, a habit of scanning for problems, looking for what needs to be fixed next, anticipating issues before they arise. This creates a state of alertness that rarely turns off. Even in moments of rest, there is a background awareness, a sense that something might go wrong, something might need attention, something might require you to step in. This prevents full relaxation, because the mind is never completely at ease. It is always prepared, always ready to act. This readiness becomes exhausting. But it is difficult to let go, because it feels necessary. It feels like if you stop, things will break, people will struggle, situations will fall apart. And this belief creates pressure, because it makes you feel responsible for outcomes that depend on many factors. It creates a burden that is too heavy to carry. There is also a deeper fear beneath this role, a fear of not being needed, of not being valuable, of not having a clear place. If you are not the one who fixes things, then who are you? This question can feel uncomfortable, because the identity has been built around action, around solving, around holding things together. Without that role, there can be a sense of emptiness, a lack of direction. This makes it harder to step back, to allow things to unfold without interference, because stepping back feels like losing something important, something that defines you. There is also the emotional cost of this attachment, because when you believe you must fix everything, every problem becomes personal. Every situation carries weight. Every outcome feels like a reflection of your effort. This creates stress because you are trying to control things that cannot be fully controlled. And when things do not go as expected, there is disappointment, sometimes even guilt. A feeling that you should have done more, that you should have handled it differently, that you are somehow responsible. But this is not accurate, because no one controls the full web of causes and conditions. No one can fix everything. Yet the belief remains, and it keeps the mind in a constant state of effort. There is also the impact on relationships. When you are always the one fixing, it changes the dynamic. Others may rely on you more than they should. They may step back, expecting you to handle things. This creates imbalance. Because responsibility is not shared, it is carried by one person, and this leads to fatigue, not just physical, but emotional, because the connection becomes less about mutual support and more about dependence. There is also a loss of authenticity, because when you are focused on fixing, you are not always present. You are thinking about solutions, about outcomes, about what needs to change. This creates distance, because you are not fully there. You are partly in the problem, partly in the solution, but not completely in the moment. There is also a subtle control in this pattern. Even when it looks like helping, there can be a hidden need to shape how things unfold, to guide situations toward a certain outcome, to influence others in ways that align with your understanding. This is not always intentional, but it is present, because fixing often involves directing, and directing involves control. This creates tension, because others may not move in the direction you expect. They may choose differently. They may act in ways that do not align with your solution, and this creates frustration, because the outcome is not matching the effort. This reveals the deeper attachment, not just to helping, but to being the one who knows how things should be, the one who guides, the one who corrects. And this attachment makes it harder to let go, because it reinforces the identity. It keeps the role active, even when it is no longer needed. There is also a lack of trust beneath this pattern, a belief that if you do not step in, things will not work out, that others cannot handle it, that situations will not resolve. This belief creates control, because it does not allow space for things to unfold naturally. It does not allow others to learn, to grow, to respond in their own way. It holds everything tightly, but this tightness creates strain because it limits flow, it limits possibility. It keeps everything within a narrow path, and this path requires constant effort to maintain. Buddhist understanding offers a different perspective. It suggests that you are not responsible for holding everything together, that life is not dependent on one person's effort, that each situation arises from many causes and conditions, and that your role is only part of that process. This understanding creates space because it allows you to step back, not in avoidance but in clarity, to act when needed, but not to carry everything. There is also a shift in how worth is experienced. It is no longer tied to fixing. It is not dependent on solving. It becomes something more stable, more internal, a sense of value that does not require constant action. This reduces pressure because you do not need to prove yourself through effort. You do not need to maintain a role to feel complete. There is also a deeper sense of trust, trust that others can find their way, trust that situations can unfold without constant intervention, trust that not everything needs to be controlled. This trust creates relief because the weight begins to lift. The mind no longer feels like it must carry everything. It begins to relax, to soften, to allow. There is also a return to presence. Because when you are not focused on fixing, you can simply be with others, with situations, without needing to change them. This creates connection, real connection, because it is not based on control. It is based on presence. And in that presence, something shifts. The constant effort fades. The need to hold everything together weakens. And in its place, there is space. Space for life to move, space for others to respond, space for you to rest. And in that rest, there is peace. Not because everything is fixed, but because the need to fix everything has been released. Now, as this attachment to being the fixer begins to loosen, something even deeper begins to reveal itself. Because letting go of control can still feel uncomfortable. It can feel like weakness, like surrender. And understanding what surrender truly means opens the next step forward. As the need to be the one who fixes everything begins to loosen, something uncomfortable rises into awareness. Without that role, without that constant effort to hold things together, there is a moment where the mind feels exposed. It asks a quiet but powerful question. If I stop controlling, if I stop fixing, if I let go, what does that make me? And this is where the next misunderstanding begins. There is a deep resistance to letting go because it feels like losing. It feels like stepping back. It feels like allowing things to fall apart. The mind has been trained to believe that strength means holding on, pushing through, staying in control no matter what. So when the idea of surrender appears, it feels dangerous. It feels like weakness. But this is not the truth. There is a different kind of strength that is not based on control, a strength that does not come from forcing life, but from understanding it. And this is where surrender begins to reveal its real meaning. There is a quiet moment when the mind realizes it cannot keep pushing, not because it lacks ability, but because it sees that the pushing itself is creating the strain. It sees that all the effort, all the control, all the resistance has not brought the peace it was seeking. This realization is not failure, it is clarity. It is the moment the illusion starts to break. Surrender is not about giving up on life. It is about giving up on the false belief that life must be controlled in order to be safe. This belief has been guiding everything, trying to manage outcomes, trying to shape people, trying to hold time in place, trying to fix every situation. But none of these efforts have created lasting ease. They have only created tension. So surrender begins as a recognition that the struggle itself is the problem, not life, not circumstances, not uncertainty, but the constant attempt to control what cannot be controlled. This recognition softens the mind. It begins to loosen the grip, not out of defeat, but out of understanding. There is a difference between stopping because you are exhausted and stopping because you see clearly. Surrender comes from seeing. Seeing that control does not lead to peace. Seeing that resistance creates suffering. Seeing that holding on creates pressure. And in that seeing, something naturally releases. There is also a deeper layer to surrender. It is not passive. It is not doing nothing. It is a shift in how action arises. Action continues, but without the attachment, without the desperation, without the need to force outcomes. This creates a different kind of movement, one that is aligned with reality, not against it. One that responds rather than reacts. One that flows rather than pushes. This is not weakness. This is precision. Because when the mind is not clouded by control, it sees more clearly. It understands what is needed. It acts appropriately, without excess effort, without unnecessary tension. There is also the courage required to surrender, because it means facing uncertainty directly, without trying to escape it, without trying to control it. It means allowing life to unfold without guarantees. And this can feel uncomfortable at first, because the mind is used to having something to hold on to, some form of control, some sense of direction. But as surrender deepens, a different kind of stability begins to appear. Not the stability of certainty, but the stability of presence. The ability to remain steady, even when things are unclear, even when outcomes are unknown. This stability is stronger than control, because it does not depend on conditions. It remains regardless of what happens. There is also a shift in how challenges are experienced. Without surrender, challenges feel like obstacles, something to overcome, something to fix, something to control. With surrender, challenges are seen as part of the unfolding, not something separate from life, but something within it. This changes the response. There is less resistance, less struggle, more openness, more willingness to meet what is happening. This does not remove difficulty, but it removes the added suffering created by fighting it. There is also a release of the need to be right, to have things go a certain way, to prove something. Surrender allows space for things to be as they are, without needing to adjust them to fit a specific image. This creates ease, because the mind is no longer trying to impose its version of reality. It is simply experiencing what is present. There is also a deeper sense of trust that emerges. Not trust that everything will go perfectly, but trust that whatever happens can be met, that there is no need to control every detail. Because life is not dependent on perfect outcomes, this trust reduces fear. Because the mind no longer feels like everything is at risk, it begins to relax, to open, to allow. There is also a connection to truth in surrender, because when control is released, reality becomes clearer. Without the distortion of expectation, without the pressure of needing things to be different. What is seen is what is. This clarity brings peace, not because reality has changed, but because the resistance to it has dissolved. There is also a simplicity in surrender, because the mind is no longer managing multiple layers of control. It is not holding on to past, future, outcomes or identities. It is simply present with what is happening now. This simplicity is powerful because it removes complexity. It removes unnecessary effort. It allows the mind to rest. There is also a freedom that comes with surrender. Freedom from the need to control, freedom from the pressure to fix everything, freedom from the constant tension of holding on. This freedom is not something that is created, it is something that is revealed. When the grip loosens, when the struggle ends, when the mind stops fighting life, and in that freedom there is peace. Not fragile peace, not conditional peace, but a steady, quiet presence that remains, regardless of what changes. This is why surrender is not weakness. It is clarity. It is strength without force. It is action without attachment. It is presence without resistance. And as this understanding of surrender begins to settle, something even more subtle starts to appear. Because even without forcing, even without controlling, there is still a tendency to react, to adjust, to interfere in small ways. And seeing that tendency clearly opens the next step forward. As surrender begins to settle, something very subtle comes into view. Even without forcing, even without holding tightly, there is still a quiet habit that continues, a small movement, a quick reaction, a need to adjust what is happening, even slightly. It is almost invisible, but it carries weight, and this is where the next layer opens. There is a moment just before you react that most people never notice. It is brief, almost silent, but it is there. Something happens, a word is spoken, a feeling arises, a situation shifts, and immediately the mind moves. It moves to respond, to fix, to correct, to shape. This movement feels natural, it feels automatic, it feels necessary, but it is not always needed. There is a belief that every situation requires a response, that every discomfort needs to be addressed, that every change must be met with action. But this belief creates constant activity, and constant activity creates noise. This noise makes it difficult to see clearly, because the mind is always moving, always adjusting, always doing something. But there is another way, a way that does not rush to react, a way that does not immediately interfere, a way that allows space. This is the peace found in non-interference. It does not mean doing nothing. It means not acting from impulse, not reacting from habit, not forcing change where none is needed. There is a difference between action and reaction. Reaction is fast, unconscious, driven by patterns. It happens before awareness has time to settle. It often comes from fear, from discomfort, from the need to regain control. Action, on the other hand, arises from clarity. It comes after seeing, after understanding. It is not rushed. It is precise. Non-interference creates the space where action can replace reaction. It allows the moment to unfold without immediate adjustment. It gives the mind time to see what is actually happening rather than what it assumes is happening. This changes everything, because many reactions are based on interpretation, not reality. A tone of voice is taken personally. A delay is seen as rejection. A change is seen as a problem. But when there is space, these interpretations can be seen more clearly. And often they dissolve because they are not grounded in what is truly happening. They are projections. Non-interference reveals this. It shows that not everything needs to be responded to, that not every thought requires action, that not every feeling needs to be fixed. There is also a deeper calm that comes from this, because the mind is no longer in constant motion. It begins to settle, to observe, to be present without interference. This creates stillness, and in that stillness, clarity appears. Because without constant reaction, the mind can see patterns. It can understand itself. It can notice how quickly it moves, how easily it is triggered, how often it tries to control. This awareness is powerful because it breaks the automatic cycle. It introduces choice, the choice to not react, the choice to not interfere, the choice to allow. There is also a shift in how discomfort is experienced. Without non-interference, discomfort leads to action, an urge to change something, to escape, to fix. But with non-interference, discomfort can be observed, felt, without being immediately acted upon. This changes the relationship with it because it is no longer something that must be removed. It becomes something that can be understood. This reduces fear because discomfort is no longer overwhelming. It is manageable. It can exist without control. There is also a reduction in unnecessary effort, because many actions are not needed. They are reactions to internal states, not responses to external reality. Non-interference removes these actions. It allows only what is necessary to remain. This simplifies life. because energy is no longer spent on constant adjustment. It is conserved, focused, used with intention. There is also a deeper trust that develops. Trust that not everything needs to be controlled, that situations can unfold, that people can respond in their own way, that life can move without constant interference. This trust reduces anxiety because the mind is no longer trying to manage every detail. It begins to relax, to allow, to observe. There is also a shift in relationships because without the need to interfere, there is more space for others. Space for them to express, to act, to be themselves, without being corrected or adjusted. This creates more authentic connection because it is not shaped by control. It is allowed to develop naturally. There is also less conflict because many conflicts arise from reaction, from trying to fix or change something immediately. Non-interference allows the situation to settle before responding. This often reduces tension, because the initial reaction is not acted upon, and what remains is more thoughtful, more grounded. There is also a deeper understanding of timing, because not everything needs to happen immediately. Some things require space, some things need time to unfold. Non-interference respects this. It does not rush. It does not force. It allows the natural timing of situations. This creates alignment, because action happens when it is appropriate, not when it is urgent. There is also a sense of ease that develops, because the mind is no longer constantly engaged in controlling. It is not always adjusting. It is not always fixing. It is simply present. This presence is peaceful because it is not driven by need, it is not driven by fear, it is not driven by control, it is just awareness. There is also a deeper insight that emerges. That much of what the mind tries to fix is not actually broken, it is simply different from expectation. Non-interference reveals this, because without immediate correction, the situation can be seen more clearly, and often it does not require intervention. This reduces unnecessary action, because the mind no longer reacts to every difference. It allows things to be. There is also a growing sense of freedom, because without constant reaction, there is more space, more openness, more possibility. Life is not being shaped in a narrow way. It is allowed to unfold, and in that unfolding, there is discovery. Because not everything is predetermined. There is room for surprise, for change, for growth. There is also a deeper connection with the present moment, because without interference, attention remains here. It is not pulled into reaction. It is not pushed into control. It stays with what is happening. This creates richness, because the moment is experienced fully, without distortion, without pressure. There is also a quiet confidence that develops, not from controlling outcomes, but from being able to remain steady without reacting. This confidence is stable because it does not depend on circumstances. It depends on awareness, and awareness is always available. There is also a sense of completion because each moment is allowed to unfold without being interrupted, without being altered prematurely. This creates a natural flow, a sense that things are moving as they should, without needing to be pushed. And in that flow, there is peace, not created by effort, not achieved through control, but revealed through non-interference, through allowing, through being present without the need to change what is. Now, as this peace in non-interference begins to deepen, something even more fundamental starts to appear. Because even when the mind stops reacting, there can still be a subtle resistance, a quiet disagreement with what is already here. And understanding that resistance opens the next step forward. As non-interference begins to settle into the way you move through life, something even more subtle comes into focus. Even when you stop reacting, even when you stop forcing, there can still be a quiet tension underneath. A silent disagreement with what is already here. It is not loud, it is not always obvious. but it is there, shaping how you feel, how you think, and how you experience every moment. And this is where the next layer begins to unfold. There is a kind of inner noise that does not come from the outside world. It comes from the mind pushing against reality, not through action, not through force, but through thought. A quiet voice that says, "This should not be happening," or "This is not how it's supposed to be," or "Something needs to change before I can feel okay." This voice creates conflict, not between you and the world, but within you, because reality is already here, unfolding as it is, while the mind is holding on to an image of how it should be. And these two do not match. This mismatch creates friction, and that friction is felt as stress, resistance, and unease. This is inner conflict. It is not created by what is happening. It is created by the refusal to allow what is happening. The mind is constantly comparing the present moment to an expectation, comparing what is to what should be, and in that comparison, it finds problems, even in simple situations. A delay becomes frustration, a feeling becomes something to get rid of, a situation becomes something to correct. This creates a constant state of tension, because the mind is always trying to move away from what is, always trying to reach something else. But reality does not change immediately, so the tension remains. There is also a deeper layer to this conflict, the belief that acceptance means approval, that if you accept something, you are agreeing with it, that you are saying it is right or good or desirable. But this is not what acceptance means. Acceptance is not agreement. It is recognition. It is seeing clearly what is already present, without adding resistance, without adding rejection, without adding the need to change it before allowing it to exist. This is a subtle but powerful shift, because when the mind stops arguing with what is, something begins to quiet. Not because the situation has changed, but because the internal resistance has softened. There is no longer a battle, no longer a push against reality. And without that push, the tension begins to dissolve. This creates space. Space for awareness, space for clarity, space for presence. There is also a change in how emotions are experienced. Without acceptance, emotions become problems, something to fix, something to remove. This creates resistance, because emotions are part of the present moment. They arise naturally, and when they are resisted, they do not disappear. They persist, often becoming stronger. With acceptance, emotions are allowed. They are felt, observed, without needing to be changed immediately. This does not make them permanent, it allows them to move. Because what is allowed can flow, what is resisted tends to stay. This changes the relationship with feelings. They are no longer threats, they are experiences, temporary, passing, not something that defines you. There is also a shift in how situations are handled. Without acceptance, there is urgency, a need to fix things quickly, to restore comfort, to regain control. With acceptance, there is patience, a willingness to see the situation clearly before acting. This leads to better decisions, because action is no longer driven by discomfort. It is guided by understanding. There is also a deeper sense of stability. Because acceptance does not depend on conditions, it does not require things to be a certain way. It is available in any moment, regardless of what is happening. This creates a form of peace that is not fragile. That does not come and go with circumstances, it remains. Because it is not tied to external factors, it is tied to how you relate to them. There is also a reduction in mental noise, because much of the noise comes from resistance, from the constant commentary about how things should be different. When this commentary stops, the mind becomes quieter, not empty, but calm, more focused, more present. This quietness allows for deeper awareness, because without distraction, you can see more clearly. You can understand what is happening without distortion. There is also a release of energy, because resistance consumes energy. It requires effort to push against reality, to argue with it, to try to change it in the mind. When that effort is removed, energy becomes available for presence, for clarity, for meaningful action. There is also a shift in how control is experienced, because acceptance reduces the need to control. When you allow what is, there is less urgency to change it, less pressure to manage every detail. This creates ease, because the mind is not constantly engaged in control. It can rest, even while life continues. There is also a deeper connection to reality, because acceptance removes the filter of expectation. You see things as they are, not as you want them to be. This clarity brings understanding, and understanding reduces confusion. There is also a sense of freedom, because without resistance, you are not bound by conditions. You are not waiting for things to change before feeling at ease. You are able to be present now, without needing anything to be different. This freedom is powerful, because it is not dependent on outcomes. It is not fragile, it remains. There is also a change in how time is experienced, because without resistance, there is less urgency, less need to rush, less need to escape. The present moment becomes enough, not because it is perfect, but because it is accepted. This creates depth, because you are fully here, not divided, not pulled in different directions. There is also a sense of completeness, because acceptance allows the moment to be whole, without needing to add or remove anything. This creates satisfaction, not from achieving something, but from being present with what is. There is also a deeper understanding that emerges, that suffering is not created by reality. It is created by resistance to reality. And when resistance ends, suffering reduces. This is not a concept. It is something that can be experienced directly, in small moments, when you stop arguing, when you allow, when you accept. There is peace, simple, quiet, available. And as this role of acceptance becomes clearer, something else begins to reveal itself. Because even when acceptance is present, there can still be a subtle movement. A desire to know what comes next, to feel certain, to have clarity about the future. And understanding this desire opens the next step forward. As acceptance begins to quiet the inner conflict, a deeper calm starts to settle. The mind is no longer arguing with what is. There is space, there is stillness, there is a sense that, in this moment, nothing is missing. But then, almost unnoticed, another movement appears. A quiet pull toward what comes next. A question that begins to form beneath the calm. What happens after this? And just like that, the mind leaves the present again. There is a subtle habit that runs deep. Even when things are okay, even when the moment is calm, the mind reaches forward. It wants to know. It wants clarity. It wants assurance about what is coming. This desire feels harmless. It feels like planning, like being prepared, like staying ahead. But beneath it, there is something else, a discomfort with not knowing. The mind does not rest easily in uncertainty. Even when there is nothing wrong, it searches for what might happen next. It tries to map out the future, to create a sense of direction, to secure a feeling of safety. And in doing so, it leaves the only place where peace exists, the present moment. There is a quiet theft that happens here, not loud, not dramatic, but constant. The moment you are in is taken away, replaced by a projection of what might be. A thought about tomorrow, a concern about an outcome, a question about what someone will say or do. These thoughts pull attention forward, and when attention moves, presence fades. This is how the desire for certainty destroys presence, not by force, but by distraction. The mind believes that knowing what comes next will create peace. That if the future can be understood, if outcomes can be predicted, then everything will feel settled. But this belief creates the opposite effect. because the future is not here. And trying to live inside it requires effort. That effort pulls you away from what is actually happening. The body remains in the present, but the mind travels, and this split creates tension. You are no longer fully in one place. Part of you is here, part of you is somewhere else. And this division prevents rest. There is also a deeper layer to this pattern. The belief that the present moment is not enough, that something else is needed, something more complete, something more certain. This belief creates a constant movement away from now, even when nothing is wrong, even when everything is quiet. There is still a sense that something needs to be figured out. This creates subtle dissatisfaction because the mind is not allowing the moment to be complete. It is always adding something, a question, a concern, a future possibility. And this addition creates noise, because instead of simply being, the mind is thinking, projecting, anticipating. This noise covers the natural stillness that is already present. It hides the peace that does not require certainty. There is also the emotional cost of this habit. When the mind is focused on the future, it often fills the unknown with imagined scenarios. Some of these are neutral, some are positive, but many are negative. Because the mind is wired to detect potential problems, so it prepares. It imagines what could go wrong, what might not work, what might create discomfort, and these imagined scenarios create real emotions, anxiety, worry, tension, all based on something that has not happened. This creates unnecessary suffering, because the mind is reacting to possibilities, not reality. And while it reacts, it misses the present moment, the place where there is no problem, the place where everything is simply unfolding. There is also the illusion that certainty will bring peace, that once the future is known, the mind will finally settle. But this is not what happens. Even when certainty is found, it is temporary, because new questions arise, new uncertainties appear, new outcomes become important. So the search continues, always moving forward, always looking for something that will finally provide stability. But that stability never fully arrives, because the future is always changing, and certainty is never permanent. This creates an endless cycle. The mind searches for certainty. It finds partial answers. Those answers create temporary relief. Then new questions appear, and the search begins again. This cycle keeps the mind in constant motion, always reaching, never fully arriving. And in that movement, presence is lost. Buddhist wisdom points to a different understanding. It shows that peace does not come from knowing the future. It comes from being fully present with what is. This does not mean ignoring the future. It means not living in it. It means allowing thoughts about what comes next to arise, but not becoming absorbed in them, not letting them take over attention, not letting them replace the present moment. This creates a different relationship with uncertainty. Instead of trying to eliminate it, there is a willingness to live with it, to allow it, to be present even when things are not fully known. This presence is powerful because it is where life is actually happening, not in tomorrow, not in imagined outcomes, but here, now. There is also a deeper sense of trust that begins to form. Not trust that everything will go as planned, but trust that you can meet whatever comes, that you do not need to know everything in advance to be okay. This trust reduces the need for certainty, because the mind no longer feels dependent on knowing. It becomes more open, more flexible, more at ease with not having all the answers. There is also a shift in how time is experienced, because without the constant focus on the future, the present becomes fuller, more vivid, more complete. Moments are no longer just steps towards something else. They are experienced in themselves. This creates richness, because attention is not divided. It is here, with what is happening. There is also a reduction in mental noise, because the mind is not constantly projecting. It is not filling space with imagined scenarios. It is simply observing. This creates quiet, and in that quiet, there is clarity. There is also a sense of freedom, because without the need to know everything, there is less pressure, less urgency, less tension. Life feels more open, more fluid, less constrained by expectations. There is also a deeper connection with reality, because you are not filtering it through future concerns. You are seeing it directly, as it is. This clarity brings understanding, and understanding brings peace. There is also a sense of completeness, because the present moment is no longer seen as lacking. It is allowed to be enough, without needing to add something from the future. This creates contentment, not based on outcomes, but based on presence. And in that presence, there is peace. Simple, quiet, available, not dependent on certainty, but revealed when the need for certainty is released. Now, as this desire for certainty begins to soften, something even deeper begins to emerge. Because even without needing to know everything, there is still a subtle hesitation, a lack of trust in how life unfolds on its own. And understanding that hesitation opens the next step forward. As the need for certainty begins to soften, something deeper quietly comes into awareness. Even without chasing answers, even without trying to control what comes next, there can still be a subtle tension, a hesitation to fully trust what cannot yet be seen. Because the mind is used to clarity, it is used to knowing where things are going, how they will unfold, what they will become. And when that clarity is not there, even if there is no immediate danger, there is a quiet unease, a feeling that something is missing. And this is where the next layer begins to open. There is a hidden impatience in the way the mind relates to life. It does not always show itself as urgency, but it is there in the background. A quiet expectation that things should reveal themselves quickly, that answers should arrive on time, that meaning should be clear without delay. When this does not happen, the mind becomes restless. It starts to question, to doubt, to search for something solid to hold on to. But life does not always reveal itself immediately. Some things unfold slowly. Some answers take time. Some paths become clear only after walking them. And this slowness creates discomfort, because the mind wants resolution. It wants to close the gap between not knowing and knowing. It wants to settle. But the unfolding of life does not always match that desire. There are moments when nothing is clear, when direction feels uncertain, when outcomes are unknown, and in these moments there is a choice: to resist the uncertainty or to trust the unfolding. Trusting the unfolding does not mean believing that everything will go perfectly. It means allowing life to reveal itself in its own time, without forcing clarity, without demanding answers, without rushing the process. This trust is not blind. It is grounded in understanding. Understanding that life is shaped by causes and conditions, that things arise when they are ready, that forcing them does not make them come faster. There is a difference between action and impatience. Action responds to what is present. Impatience tries to pull the future closer, and this pulling creates tension, because the future cannot be rushed. It arrives when it arrives. Trusting the unfolding removes this tension. It allows time to move naturally. It allows situations to develop without interference. It allows clarity to appear when conditions support it. There is also a deeper layer to this trust. It involves letting go of the need to understand everything immediately, because not all understanding comes through thinking. Some understanding comes through experience, through living, through being present with what is happening. This kind of understanding cannot be forced. It grows, it unfolds, and it requires patience. The mind often underestimates this. It believes that more thinking will bring clarity, that analyzing will lead to answers. But often thinking creates more noise, more confusion, because it tries to solve something that is not ready to be solved. Trusting the unfolding allows space. Space for things to settle. Space for insight to arise naturally. This space is important, because without it, the mind fills everything with effort, with searching, with trying. And this effort blocks the quiet clarity that comes when things are allowed to be. There is also a sense of relief that comes with this trust, because the pressure to figure everything out begins to fade. The mind no longer feels like it must have all the answers. It becomes more comfortable with not knowing, more at ease with uncertainty. This ease creates calm, because the mind is not constantly pushing, not constantly searching. It is simply present. There is also a shift in how time is experienced. Without the need for immediate answers, time feels more open, less rushed, less pressured. Moments are not seen as delays. They are seen as part of the process. This changes the experience of waiting. Waiting is no longer something to endure. It becomes something to be present with, something that holds its own value. There is also a deeper connection with life, because when you trust the unfolding, you are not trying to control it. You are allowing it. This creates alignment, because you are moving with life, not against it. There is less friction, less resistance, less struggle. There is also a reduction in fear, because fear often comes from the unknown, from what has not yet been revealed. But when there is trust, the unknown is not threatening, it is simply part of the journey. This changes the emotional response. Instead of anxiety, there is curiosity. Instead of tension, there is openness. There is also a sense of humility that develops. Because trusting the unfolding acknowledges that you do not control everything, that there are forces beyond your understanding, that life is larger than your plans. This humility is not weakness, it is clarity. It removes the illusion of control, and in doing so, it removes the pressure that comes with it. There is also a deeper form of confidence, not based on certainty, but based on the ability to stay present without it. This confidence is stable, because it does not depend on outcomes. It depends on awareness, on presence, on the ability to meet what arises. There is also a sense of freedom, because without the need to know everything, there is less limitation, less rigidity, more space for life to unfold in unexpected ways. This creates possibility, because not everything is predetermined. There is room for change, for growth, for new directions that were not imagined. There is also a deeper peace, because the mind is no longer in conflict with time. It is not trying to speed things up. It is not trying to force clarity. It is allowing, and in that allowing, there is rest. Not because everything is resolved, but because the need for immediate resolution has softened. There is also a quiet appreciation that begins to appear, for the process itself, for the unfolding, for the way life reveals itself gradually. This appreciation brings presence, because attention is no longer focused on the end. It is here, with each step. There is also a deeper understanding that life is not something to be solved, it is something to be lived, and living requires presence. Not constant analysis, not constant control, but openness, awareness, trust. And in that trust, there is peace, not created, not forced, but revealed, as the mind relaxes its need to know, as it allows life to unfold, as it stays present with what is. Now, as this trust begins to deepen, another distinction becomes clear, because even when you trust life, there is still a question of how to act within it, how to care, how to engage, without falling back into control. And understanding this balance opens the next step forward. As trust in the unfolding of life begins to deepen, another question quietly rises. If you are no longer forcing, no longer chasing certainty, no longer trying to control every outcome, then how do you live? How do you care, act, and stay committed without falling back into the same patterns? because something inside still wants to contribute, to show up, to take responsibility. And this is where the next understanding begins to take shape. There is a quiet confusion that lives inside many people. It is not always obvious, but it shapes how effort is applied. It is the belief that caring deeply means controlling outcomes. That if something matters, it must be managed closely. That responsibility requires holding everything together. This belief creates pressure because it blends two very different things into one: responsibility and control. At first they seem similar. Both involve action, both involve attention, both involve engagement with life, but the experience of each is completely different. Control feels heavy, responsibility feels grounded. Control carries tension, responsibility carries clarity. Control is driven by fear of what might happen. Responsibility is guided by what can be done. When these are confused, life becomes exhausting, because every situation becomes something that must be controlled in order to feel secure. Every outcome becomes something that must be guaranteed. Every action becomes tied to a result that cannot be fully managed. This creates a constant state of strain. But when the difference becomes clear, something begins to shift. Responsibility does not require control. It requires presence. It requires awareness of what is happening. It requires the willingness to act where action is possible, nothing more, nothing less. There is a quiet strength in this, because it focuses energy on what is real, not on what is imagined, not on what is beyond reach, but on what is actually here. Control, on the other hand, moves beyond what is real. It tries to extend influence into areas that cannot be fully reached. It tries to shape outcomes, manage perceptions, direct timing. And this extension creates tension because it is not supported by reality. There is also a deeper layer to this confusion, the belief that letting go of control means not caring, that if you are not trying to manage everything, you are being careless, passive, or detached. But this is not true. Letting go of control allows for deeper care, because the care is no longer mixed with fear. It is no longer tied to outcomes. It is not conditional. It is simply present. This kind of care is steady. It does not fluctuate based on results. It does not disappear when things do not go as expected. It remains, because it is not dependent on success. It is rooted in intention. There is also a shift in how effort is experienced. With control, effort feels urgent. It carries pressure. It feels like something must be secured. With responsibility, effort is steady. It moves at the pace of the moment. It responds to what is needed, without rushing, without forcing. This creates ease, because the mind is not constantly pushing. It is simply engaged. There is also a difference in how outcomes are held. Control clings to outcomes. It attaches meaning to them. It makes them necessary. Responsibility releases outcomes. It understands that they arise from many factors. It does not try to hold them. This creates freedom, because the mind is not tied to results. It can act fully, without being bound by what happens next. There is also a deeper sense of trust in responsibility. Trust that doing what can be done is enough. Trust that life will unfold through causes and conditions. Trust that not everything needs to be controlled. This trust reduces anxiety. Because the mind is no longer trying to manage everything, it becomes more relaxed, more open, more at ease. There is also a shift in how failure is experienced. With control, failure feels personal. It feels like something went wrong that should have been prevented. With responsibility, failure is part of the process. It is information. It shows what can be learned. This reduces fear, because outcomes are not tied to identity. They are simply results. There is also a difference in relationships. Control tries to shape others, to influence their responses, to manage their behavior. Responsibility respects others. It allows them to act, to choose, to respond in their own way. This creates space, because relationships are not forced. They are allowed to develop naturally. There is also less conflict, because control often creates resistance. People do not respond well to being managed. Responsibility, on the other hand, creates openness, because it does not impose, it engages. There is also a deeper connection with the present moment, because responsibility is rooted in what is happening now. It does not depend on future outcomes. It does not require certainty. It simply responds to what is here. This creates presence, because attention is not divided, it is fully engaged. There is also a sense of completeness, because each action is taken fully, without holding on to it afterward. This creates closure, because nothing is left hanging in the mind. There is also a deeper peace, because responsibility does not create tension. It does not push against reality, it works with it. This alignment creates calm, because there is no resistance. There is also a sense of empowerment, not from controlling outcomes, but from being able to act clearly, to respond wisely, to engage without attachment. This empowerment is stable, because it does not depend on results. It depends on awareness. There is also a shift in how life is experienced, because without control there is more openness, more flexibility, more possibility. Life is not constrained by rigid expectations. It is allowed to unfold. This creates richness, because experiences are not limited, they are explored. There is also a deeper understanding that emerges. That responsibility is about participation, not domination. It is about being part of the process, not controlling it. This understanding changes everything, because it removes the burden of control and replaces it with clarity. There is also a sense of balance, because effort and ease coexist. Action and rest are not in conflict. They flow together, naturally, without force. And in that balance, there is peace. Not because everything is controlled, but because nothing needs to be. Now, as this distinction between responsibility and control becomes clearer, another layer begins to reveal itself. Because even when you act responsibly, there can still be a subtle attachment, a desire for others to change, to understand, to move in a certain way. And understanding this desire opens the next step forward. As the difference between responsibility and control becomes clearer, another layer quietly reveals itself. Even when you act with clarity, even when you release the need to control outcomes, there is still a subtle place where the mind holds on, not to situations, not to results, but to people. Because something inside still wants others to understand, to change, to grow in a certain way. And when that does not happen, tension returns. And this is where a deeper truth begins to unfold. There is a quiet weight that comes from caring about someone and wanting things to be better for them. It can feel like love. It can feel like concern. It can feel like responsibility. But underneath it, there is often something else, a need for their journey to move according to your understanding. This need is rarely seen clearly. It appears as advice, as guidance, as support. But it carries expectation. An expectation that they will see what you see, that they will change when you think they should, that they will grow in the direction you believe is right. When this expectation is not met, something inside reacts. There is frustration, there is disappointment, sometimes even anger. Not because you do not care, but because the outcome does not match what you hoped for. This creates suffering. Because their journey is not yours to control. Each person moves through life based on their own causes and conditions, their experiences, their understanding, their timing, their readiness. These factors are not always visible, and they are not always aligned with your expectations. But the mind often forgets this. It believes that if something is clear to you, it should be clear to them. If something feels obvious, it should be obvious to them. If something needs to change, it should happen now. This creates pressure, not only on them, but on you, because you are holding on to something that cannot be forced. Growth does not happen on command. Understanding does not arrive on schedule. Awareness does not follow instruction. These things unfold slowly, naturally, through experience, through insight, through conditions that are unique to each person. Trying to control this process creates tension because it goes against how life actually works. There is also a deeper layer to this attachment, a belief that if someone changes, things will feel better, that if they understand, the situation will resolve, that if they grow, there will be peace. This belief ties your inner state to their journey, and because their journey is not in your control, your peace becomes unstable. It rises when they move in the direction you expect. It falls when they do not. This creates emotional dependence, not obvious but present. Your sense of ease becomes connected to their progress, and this connection creates suffering because it is not something you can fully manage. There is also the subtle control in trying to help. Not all help is free. Sometimes it carries expectation, an expectation of change, an expectation of response, an expectation of appreciation. When these expectations are not met, the help turns into frustration, because it was not just given. It was tied to an outcome. This creates tension in relationships, because the intention to support becomes mixed with the need to control. And this can be felt, even if it is not spoken. People sense when they are being shaped, when their journey is being directed, and this can create resistance, because each person has their own path, their own pace, their own process. There is also the difficulty of watching someone struggle. It is not easy to see someone you care about make choices that lead to pain, to see them repeat patterns, to see them miss what feels obvious. This creates discomfort, and the mind tries to remove that discomfort by stepping in, by correcting, by guiding, by trying to speed up their process. But this often creates more tension, because it interferes with their experience. And without experience, understanding does not deepen. People do not grow through instruction alone. They grow through living, through making mistakes, through seeing consequences, through arriving at understanding in their own time. This cannot be rushed, and trying to rush it creates suffering. There is also the illusion of knowing what is best. Even with good intentions, there is a limit to how much you can understand another person's path. Their internal world is complex. Their experiences are unique. What seems right from your perspective may not align with what they need to learn. This creates a gap, and trying to close that gap through control creates friction, because it is based on incomplete understanding. Releasing the need to control their journey does not mean not caring. It means caring without attachment, without needing a specific outcome, without needing them to be different in order for you to feel at peace. This creates a different kind of support, one that is present but not controlling, one that listens but does not impose, one that allows rather than directs. This support is lighter because it does not carry expectation. It does not create pressure. It simply exists. There is also a deeper sense of respect that comes with this. Respect for their path, their timing, their process. Even when it is difficult to watch, even when it does not make sense. This respect creates space because it acknowledges that each person is responsible for their own journey. And that responsibility cannot be taken away. There is also a shift in how relationships are experienced. Without the need to control, there is more openness, more authenticity. Because interactions are not shaped by expectation, they are allowed to unfold naturally. This creates connection. Because it is not based on change, it is based on presence. There is also a reduction in emotional strain. Because you are no longer carrying the weight of their journey. You are not responsible for their progress. You are not responsible for their choices. You are only responsible for how you show up. This creates relief, because the burden becomes lighter. There is also a deeper peace, because your state is no longer tied to their actions. It becomes stable, independent, grounded in your own awareness. There is also a sense of freedom, because without the need to control others, there is more space, more energy, more clarity. You are not constantly monitoring, adjusting, or guiding. You are simply present. There is also a deeper understanding that emerges, that everyone is unfolding in their own way, through their own conditions, through their own experiences, and that this unfolding cannot be forced. This understanding brings humility, because it shows that you are not the center of their journey. You are part of it, but not in control of it. And in that humility there is peace, not because everything is resolved, but because the need to resolve everything has softened. Now, as this need to control others begins to dissolve, something even more subtle begins to appear. Because even when you release control over people, there can still be a quiet discomfort, a hesitation to live without clear answers, without knowing what lies ahead. And understanding that hesitation opens the next step forward.